An all-American family. That's how friends, neighbors, and even investigators described the Swarner household. But on the quiet morning of Friday, January 24, 2025, that perfect image shattered. All 4 members of the family were found dead inside their home. They have no known enemies, and there was no history of violence. So who could have done something so unimaginable? Before we dive in, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. It helps spread these stories so more people can hear them. When we say an all-American family, we really mean it. The Swarners had everything that word usually stands for: warm smiles, busy schedules, and a life that looked perfectly normal from the outside. Karen Swarner wasn't just a mom. She was a physician assistant, someone who spent her days helping and healing people. Back in her school days, she'd been a star softball player, the kind of person teammates remembered for her drive and heart. At just 32, she was living the life she had worked hard for: a stable career, a loving husband, and 2 young kids who lit up her world. And then there was 5-year-old Evelyn, who had just learned how to read her favorite storybooks by herself, and 1-year-old Connor, the giggly baby who followed everyone around with a smile. They lived on Keck Lane in Ruff's Dale, a quiet, almost storybook neighborhood tucked inside Hempfield Township, Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. It's the kind of place where neighbors wave when you drive by, where the loudest sound you hear is a lawnmower or kids playing outside. The Swarners fit right in, ordinary, wholesome, the kind of family you'd see in a Christmas card photo and think, they've got it all together. Paul Swarner, 35, was Karen's husband and the father of their 2 kids. And I know we've said it many times, but from the outside, they really did look happy. No drama, no tension, nothing out of the ordinary. If you scrolled through their social media, you'd see smiling photos, family outings, and posts that screamed stability and love. There were no red flags, no history of domestic issues, no 911 calls, not even neighbors whispering that something might be wrong. But that's the thing about appearances. They can lie. All-American family sounds perfect, but it's often just the surface, a mask people wear. It's the bright smiles at church, the matching holiday sweaters, and the friendly waves at the school drop-off. It's easy to fool the world when you look like everything's fine, even when something's quietly breaking apart behind closed doors. Then came Wednesday, January 22nd, 2025. Karen spoke to her family like she always did. But the next day, Thursday the 23rd, things started to feel off. Her family tried to reach her but got no response. They tried Paul, but still nothing. Hours went by, and that silence became deafening. And in today's world, where everyone's attached to their phone, you know that kind of silence means something's wrong. By 11:30 that night, Karen's dad couldn't take it anymore. The unease had turned into panic. He drove to their house on Keck Lane, but the place was dark and still. He knocked on the door, but no one answered. That's when he went inside. And what he found inside that room would haunt him forever. Paul, Karen, Evelyn, Connor. All 4 gone, all in the same room. A Ruger .22 handgun was found nearby. Within minutes, state police from the Greensburg barracks arrived, and soon after, Westmoreland County Coroner Tim Carson confirmed what no parent should ever have to face. Trooper Steve Limani described the scene as unthinkable and unfathomable, words that still don't come close to the reality of what was discovered that night. Investigators believe Paul shot Karen, then their 5-year-old daughter Evelyn, then their 1-year-old son Connor, before turning the gun on himself. But the question that still hangs in the air isn't how, it's why. Because when a family that looked this perfect, this ordinary, ends in tragedy like this, the real mystery isn't just what happened inside that house on Keck Lane. It's who Paul Swarner really was, and what could have possibly snapped inside him before he pulled that trigger. Now,
first at 4, tragedy in a local neighborhood. Police say a father killed his wife and 2 young children before turning the gun on himself.
It's a story that has shocked both investigators and the community and is leaving everyone asking, how could this happen?
Now, Paul wasn't a public figure, and very little is known about his upbringing or past. What we know for sure, and at the time of making this video, was that he has no criminal record, no history of violence, not even a hint of trouble in his adult life. Those who knew him described him as polite, calm, and family-oriented, the kind of man who waved to neighbors, mowed his lawn on weekends, and took family photos with a smile that didn't look forced. He grew up in Pennsylvania in what most would describe as an ordinary, working-class family. His childhood was quiet and structured, the kind of upbringing where routine mattered, where you showed respect, kept your head down, and did what was expected of you. There was nothing extraordinary about his early years, but that's what made them so normal. He wasn't the kind of boy who got into fights or caused trouble. Instead, he followed rules, listened to authority, and stayed out of drama. From a young age, Paul was taught to value hard work and responsibility. He helped around the house, respected his parents, and did well enough in school to stay off anyone's radar. He wasn't the star athlete or the class clown, just the quiet, reliable kid who people tended to overlook. That quietness followed him into adulthood. He wasn't outspoken or attention-seeking. He preferred routine, predictability, and the safety of normal life. If you met him in passing, you probably wouldn't think twice. He looked like someone who had his priorities in order: work, home, family. The kind of person who kept his yard neat, paid his bills on time, and didn't like to cause waves. There was nothing menacing or unpredictable about him. Even their neighbor Dick Shawley told reporters he'd just seen his kids not long ago. They had just opened their Christmas presents, playing and laughing like any normal kids would. There was no tension, no sign that something was coming, nothing that screamed danger. And that's what makes it so disturbing. No one saw it coming. On January 24th, Trooper Steve Lamani held a press briefing confirming what no one wanted to believe. It was a murder-suicide. He described the Swarners as an all-American family and confirmed there were no records of domestic violence or prior calls to their home. Nothing in the system hinted that something was wrong, but here's the question everyone keeps circling back to. If there were no warning signs, if everything looked fine, what happened between January 22nd and January 23rd that made a 35-year-old man kill his wife and 2 children? Investigators got a search warrant and seized everything they could: phones, computers, maybe even footage from the baby monitor. They're digging for clues, trying to understand what Paul Swarner was thinking before that night. But so far, there's been no clear answer, no text, no note, no message that explains any of this. And this wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the second murder-suicide in Westmoreland County in just over a month. 2 families completely erased. 2 men who turned on the people they were supposed to love and protect. That's the kind of pattern that keeps people awake at night, because it's not the strangers we fear anymore. It's the person sharing your home, the one you trust, the one who kisses your kids goodnight. Here's the hard truth: family annihilations, when one member kills the whole family, happen more often than most people realize. The story almost always sounds the same. A man feels trapped, ashamed, or hopeless. Money issues, relationship problems, mental health struggles. And instead of getting help, he decides that ending everything is somehow the answer. Forensic work is still underway. Toxicology, autopsy details, even the order of the shootings haven't been released. But at this point, does it even matter? The simple, awful truth is that a man murdered his family and then killed himself. And this story isn't just about the Swarners. It's about how familicides keep happening in homes that look normal. About how we ignore red flags because they don't fit our picture of good families. In America, a woman is killed by a current or former partner every few hours. Children are often caught in the middle. And the killers? They don't look like monsters. They look like fathers, husbands, neighbors, men who seem fine until they're not. So when Trooper Limani called them all-American, it forces you to wonder, what does that even mean anymore? Does it mean safe, or does it just mean good at hiding the cracks? Karen's father will live with this forever. He's the one who found them. He's the one who'll replay that night for the rest of his life, wondering if there was anything he could have done. There's no justice, no courtroom, no sentencing. Paul is gone, and the case is closed on paper, but not in the hearts of those left behind. And that's what makes this story hit so hard. Because if there were no signs, no history, no red flags, how do we stop this from happening again? Because somewhere right now, in another quiet neighborhood, there's another family that looks just like the Swarners. And unless we start taking mental health, gun safety, and silent suffering seriously, this won't be the last time we're asking why.
Hold on. Don't move.
I'm here.
I know. Don't move.
I don't want to die.
We're going to take care of you, okay?
Make me alive.
These were the chilling final moments of a 16-year-old, a child who became the third of 4 victims, murdered by the very man she once called her dad. To the outside world, the Kahler family was the epitome of the American dream. Successful, beautiful, and seemingly perfect. Neighbors admired them, friends envied them, and strangers wished for a life like theirs. But behind that polished facade lay a storm of secrets, manipulation, and simmering rage. The cracks in their picture-perfect life grew too wide to hide, and when they finally broke, it wasn't just a family falling apart, it was a tragedy that no one could have imagined. James Craig Kahler, the patriarch, appeared to have it all. With a 6-figure salary and a stable career, he was the provider of a dream life. His wife, Karen, embodied the perfect housewife and supermom, managing the home and supporting their 3 kids, Emily, Lauren, and Sean. From straight-A report cards to local sports stardom, the Kahler kids seemed to thrive under their parents' guidance. They were everything a family was supposed to be, or so it seemed. Let's rewind the clock, and you'll find the story of how this perfect family was built on sacrifices, compromises, and silent struggles. For starters, Karen gave up her dreams of earning an engineering degree to marry Craig and support his ambitions. The couple tied the knot in December 1985 and moved to Colorado, where Craig had landed a promising job. At the time, Karen was still in her 2nd year of college, with several years left to complete her degree. But she couldn't bear the idea of a long-distance relationship, so Karen made a life-changing decision. She left school to focus on her marriage and Craig's career. It was a sacrifice she wholeheartedly embraced, determined to create a happy life together. Their first major milestone came on April 8, 1991, when Karen gave birth to their eldest daughter, Emily. Life seemed picture perfect. Craig's career continued to flourish, while Karen took on the role of a stay-at-home mom. However, Karen's mother, Pat, noticed how Karen was always putting Craig's needs before her own, even after just having a baby. It seemed off, like Karen wasn't living for herself anymore. In 1992, Craig's career brought another change, a lucrative job opportunity in Greenville, Texas. The family relocated, and in May 1993, they welcomed their 2nd daughter, Lauren. By all appearances, the Kahlers had it all. Craig's professional success, Karen's dedication to her family, and 2 bright, thriving daughters.
Emily was the firstborn, and she was a smart kid, a pleaser, wanted to do good, kind of like her mom, creative and smart. Emily played the drum set and sang, and Lauren played the bass and sang.
Yet beneath the surface, tensions quietly simmered. One of those tensions arose from a disagreement over having more children. Karen felt their family was complete with 2 kids, but Craig wanted another. In a strikingly unorthodox move, the couple created a written agreement. Karen consented to having 1 more child, on the condition that she could undergo a procedure to prevent any further pregnancies afterward. Craig agreed, and in March 1999, their son, Sean, was born. To honor their agreement, Craig later underwent a vasectomy, ensuring no more surprises in their growing family. By this point, life seemed to stabilize. Craig's next job opportunity led them to Weatherford, Texas, a quiet suburb near Dallas, where his career continued to ascend. Once again, Karen adapted, immersing herself in her new community. She joined a local moms group and eventually became its president, building a strong network of friends and resources. She also made sure her kids stayed active and involved. Emily excelled in school and music, Lauren thrived in sports and band, and Sean became a rising baseball star. From the outside, it looked like the perfect life. But Craig's obsession with perfection left little room for anything less than flawless. He held everyone to incredibly high standards, including his own family. His daughter Lauren, who struggled with ADD and didn't get straight A's like Emily, became a target for his criticism. To Craig, Lauren wasn't good enough, and he didn't hesitate to ridicule her for it. And Craig's need for control didn't stop at his family. People began to see him as uptight, rude, and almost arrogant. His obsession with appearances made him difficult to work with. He had little respect for women in leadership roles, even telling others that they didn't belong in those positions. He also gained a reputation for being cheap, borrowing tools for home projects instead of buying them, tagging along to strip clubs with coworkers, and asking them to buy him dances. Despite earning a solid $180,000 a year, Craig kept a tight grip on the family's finances. Karen had a strict weekly allowance, and every time she went shopping, she had to save the receipts. Craig would scrutinize each one when he got home, blowing up in anger if he thought something was unnecessary or too expensive. But it wasn't just about money. Craig's control extended to every aspect of their life, even their sex life. Every night at 8:30 p.m., Karen had to be in bed for their routine. If she took a phone call after 8 p.m., she would whisper to her friends, apologizing and saying she had to go because Craig required her to be in the bedroom at a specific time.
If she didn't do what he wanted, bedtime at 9, she would, quote, pay for it.
It became such a routine that their kids even knew not to disturb them after 8:30. Even when Karen was sick, she had to comply with Craig's demands. Refusing him was dangerous. His anger would often turn violent, and Karen knew it was easier to just give in. Now, things haven't always been this way. When they first got together, Karen's life wasn't controlled so strictly, but as time went on, Craig's demands grew more extreme. He even suggested bringing a third person, specifically a woman, into their relationship, just to watch Karen and her together. Karen wasn't comfortable with this at all, but she found it difficult to say no. Desperate for some space and something of her own, Karen secretly joined a gym. She'd always enjoyed working out, and it was a way to regain some control over her life. Craig, ever controlling, refused to pay for the membership, so Karen worked odd jobs, like baking cakes, to fund it herself. By January 2006, she had saved enough to join Powerhouse Gym, and she quickly became a regular. Eventually, she even took on a part-time job as a personal trainer. Surprisingly, Craig didn't mind her working at the gym, but he set one condition. She had to be home by the time the kids returned from school. And just like always, Karen excelled at whatever she did. She quickly made friends at the gym and soon developed a habit of complaining about Craig at work. She'd talk about how angry he always was, how nothing she did ever seemed good enough, and how they were constantly fighting. Their fights were so intense that sometimes one of the kids would have to intervene just to break it up. On a bad day, things would get physical, and Karen would end up with bruises to prove it. Everyone at the gym knew about her unhappiness and how she wanted out of the relationship, but Craig's control over her was suffocating. She was nearing her breaking point, and things only seemed to get worse when she met a personal trainer named Sunny. Sunny was calm and understanding, and she helped Karen open up about the darkest parts of her relationship, things she couldn't share with anyone else. Over time, Sunny and Karen became more than friends. The two grew romantically and sexually intimate. There's some speculation about how this happened. Some believe that Craig encouraged it after he had previously asked Karen to bring a third person into their relationship, while others think Karen and Sonny had already started an affair before Craig even knew about it. Regardless of how it began, their relationship evolved into a threesome. Craig even sent Sonny flirty texts, bought flowers for both women, and encouraged them to take weekend getaways. However, later on, he denied pushing the two together. While Karen and Sonny's relationship was out in the open, Craig told a different story. He claimed that Karen was ruining their marriage, and the biggest issue was that his carefully curated image of the perfect family was crumbling. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. In 2008, Craig saw an opportunity to regain control. He was offered a job in Columbia, Missouri, that paid more than his current position, and it would separate Karen from Sonny. He accepted the job offer immediately. Karen, however, was devastated. She didn't want to leave Sonny but also had roots in Weatherford. Her kids were involved in school activities, the girls were in a band, Sean was playing baseball, and Karen had deep ties to local volunteer groups. Still, as always, Craig's wishes prevailed. He moved to Columbia a few months before Karen, leaving her to wrap things up at home. During this time, Karen and Sonny decided to stay together long distance, though Craig had no idea. He thought it was just a temporary fling, and once he separated them, Karen would return to the obedient wife he expected her to be. When Karen eventually moved to Columbia with the kids, Craig believed everything was back to normal. He even allowed her to enroll in the University of Missouri for a health science degree and continue working as a fitness instructor. However, after her time with Sonny, Karen had experienced a taste of freedom. She wasn't satisfied with just being allowed to go to school or work. She didn't want a life where Craig felt entitled to control her every move. Once Craig realized he was losing control over his wife, Karen, he began to tighten his grip even harder. He started obsessively monitoring her every move, who she talked to, what was in her emails, where she went, and it quickly spiraled into a complete invasion of her privacy. This toxic obsession reached its breaking point in December 2008 during an old friend's New Year's Eve party in Weatherford. Neither Craig nor Karen expected Sonny to be at the party, but when they walked in, there she was, the last person Craig ever wanted to see. To make matters worse, Karen was openly flirty with Sonny. They were laughing, hugging, drinking from the same glass with 2 straws, and even getting cozy in front of everyone. At this point, Craig was furious. His jealousy and rage took over, especially because the relationship between Karen and Sonny was now completely public. In Craig's mind, it was a complete slap in the face, and the disrespect was unbearable. The anger exploded at the party, with Craig screaming at Karen and Karen screaming back. It wasn't just a private argument. It was a spectacle. Their fight became so intense that Craig, humiliated and furious, declared to the entire party that Karen was having an affair. In retaliation, Karen kissed Sonny right in front of everyone. The host, understandably uncomfortable, asked them to leave, but the drama didn't end there. The fight continued outside on the front lawn, and it soon turned physical. Craig, consumed by his anger, shoved Karen, causing her to fall and hit her head on the ground. By the morning, both of them were reeling from the fallout. Karen, despite the chaos, began to have second thoughts about the way she was pushing Craig. She told Sonny that they needed to take a break from their relationship, but Sonny wasn't having it. She told Karen that the problem wasn't with her, but with Craig. Sonny was deeply concerned for Karen's safety, especially after witnessing his violent outbursts. So, in late January 2009, Karen made the brave decision to file for divorce. She didn't leave the house immediately, but she started sleeping in a separate room. She also continued her long-distance relationship with Sonny. Craig, still obsessively controlling, kept monitoring Karen's emails and even went through her things. He found multiple greeting cards from Sonny and used that to track her every move. Each time Karen made plans to meet Sonny, Craig would follow her, trying to sabotage their time together. His jealousy knew no bounds. At work, Craig became increasingly unhinged. He would carry around a photo album, showing it off to coworkers and saying things like, "Isn't this a happy family? Why doesn't Karen want to be a happy family?" His bizarre behavior made everyone uncomfortable, but Craig didn't seem to notice or care. He was too consumed by his need to control Karen's life. The tension reached a boiling point in March 2009 after Craig gave a speech at a city council meeting. Karen, there to support him, was dragged into another heated argument. This time, Craig's anger turned physical. He assaulted Karen, and she called the police. Craig was arrested for third-degree domestic assault. In her statement to the police, Karen described how Craig physically blocked her exit, cornering her against a cabinet, and how his behavior had grown increasingly violent and controlling over time. Despite Craig's denial of the assault, claiming he was only trying to give Karen a hug, the marks on Karen's body told a different story. Craig was arrested and charged. Karen moved out of their home, taking the kids with her, and rented a place on the other side of Columbia. She also withdrew $50,000 from their shared bank account, signaling that she was finally breaking free from Craig's toxic and dangerous control. Now, the arrest of Craig was nothing short of devastating. As a city official, his actions were front-page news, and when his bizarre and unsettling behavior at work came to light, it only made things worse. Eventually, the city issued a public statement saying Craig resigned due to difficult family issues, but the truth was far more complicated. The fact that he had been fired, not by choice, was a blow to his already fragile ego. He couldn't handle the fact that his once perfect reputation was now in tatters. No job, no family, and no control over anything. Craig packed up and left his house, heading back to his parents' farm in Kansas. He hoped that hard work on the farm would help clear his mind, but the distance didn't make things better. If anything, it fueled his obsession with Karen, his ex-wife. Craig couldn't understand why Karen had left him. In his mind, he had been the perfect husband. He had provided everything, and yet she walked away. He refused to accept that his controlling behavior could have pushed her to the brink. At this point, he still stalked her, reading her texts, emails, and even her cards. He couldn't let go, and he blamed Sonny for everything. When Sonny sent Craig a text telling him Karen didn't love him the way he thought, Craig became enraged. He started calling Karen and Sonny names, using homophobic slurs, even though he had been okay with Karen's relationship with Sonny, as long as he could watch and be involved in some twisted way. But what really pushed him over the edge was his daughters turning away from him. They were tired of his controlling ways and wanted to make their own choices. Emily, his oldest daughter, was the first to break away. She picked a college he didn't approve of, showing she wasn't going to live by his rules anymore. To Craig, this felt like a slap in the face. He blamed Karen even more, saying she had brainwashed the girls into going against him. Things only got even worse when one of his daughters posted on Facebook, admitting she was bisexual. Instead of supporting her, Craig saw this as another reason to lash out. He was convinced their mom had influenced this too. Interestingly, he started building a massive case against Karen, collecting over 3,500 pages of so-called evidence for his divorce attorney. This included screenshots of Karen and Sonny's private messages and notes about every time Karen visited Sonny. He even claimed that the two women had sex in front of the kids, but he never showed any proof of this. Craig's behavior became even more bizarre and disturbing. He told his friends about wanting to kill Sonny, but no one took him seriously. It's a common theme in these cases. People ignore the red flags until it's too late. It's also important to note that despite his rage toward Karen and Sonny, Craig was also sleeping with multiple women. His behavior was all over the place, but when it came to his son, Sean, things seemed a bit different. According to Craig, Sean was the one person who hadn't completely turned his back on him. Craig made an effort to spend time with his son, taking him hunting and fishing, trying to stay involved in his life. While he may have been a terrible husband to Karen and a distant, controlling father to his daughters by all accounts, he was still trying to be a decent dad to Sean. It was as if Sean was the last shred of hope for Craig, the one connection that hadn't been completely destroyed. Fast forward to Thanksgiving 2009. While Sean was with Craig, Karen was still trying to keep her family close. She wanted all of her children and her girlfriend Sunny to visit her grandmother Dorothy during the holiday. So, the day after Thanksgiving, Karen went to pick up Sean from Craig's house and take him to Dorothy's. Dorothy, who was 89 years old, lived in a quiet farmhouse in Burlingame, Kansas, a tiny town with less than 1,000 residents. But on Saturday, November 29, 2009, a deputy was wrapping up some paperwork when a call came in about a suspicious vehicle in Burlingame. It was just after 6 p.m. when a neighbor reported that a small truck had been speeding through the area. They watched as the driver pulled up, got out of the truck, and started walking down the road. A few moments later, the man came back carrying a large object they couldn't identify. Fearing that it may have been a robbery, the neighbors grabbed a flashlight and went outside to confront him. But before they could get close, the man placed the object in the back seat of the truck, climbed in, and sped off. The neighbors quickly called the sheriff's office, and the deputy set out to investigate. But just minutes later, another call came in, one that would lead to a much darker discovery. The deputies immediately knew this was serious, but nothing could have prepared them for what they would find when they arrived. As they entered Dorothy's home, the first person they found was Dorothy herself. She was bleeding heavily on the kitchen floor, having been shot several times. She was still alive, but barely. They rushed to the next room, where Karen was found in the dining area. She had been shot twice and was already dead. In the lounge, they discovered 18-year-old Emily, lying behind the couch. She, too, had been shot twice. The second shot likely paralyzed her instantly, and she had died. Then the deputy heard a faint voice calling for help from upstairs. It was Lauren. 16-year-old Lauren was still alive, but her injuries were severe. Like Dorothy, she had been shot multiple times and was barely holding on. As she was taken away, Lauren whispered the name Craig. When asked who that was, she weakly replied, "My dad."
Hold on. Don't move.
I'm here.
I know. Don't move.
I don't want to die.
We're going to take care of you, okay?
Make me alive.
And it didn't take long before Lauren, too, succumbed to her injuries and died. Dorothy, who had been fighting for her life with everything she had, followed soon after. That left us with the only surviving member of the family, Sean, an unwilling witness to this senseless bloodshed. According to his account, he and Karen had been sitting together, cleaning some old coins when the nightmare began. Without warning, Craig burst through the back door, rifle in hand, and opened fire on Karen. In the chaos, Sean ran for his life, desperate to escape. He scrambled for Karen's phone to call for help, but before he could, more gunshots echoed through the house. Terrified, he knew he had to get out, and so he fled, running for the neighbor next door. Understandably, a search warrant was issued immediately for Craig, and it didn't take long for the authorities to locate his car, abandoned in the middle of nowhere, eerily out of place. Inside, the officers found a chilling scene: a stash of more ammunition, unopened bottles of anxiety medication, and a backpack packed with the essentials such as soap, toilet paper, and canned food, as if he had been preparing for something. But Craig himself was nowhere to be found. Hours later, though, he was spotted wandering aimlessly down a deserted road, disheveled and looking lost. When he saw the officers approach, he didn't try to run. Instead, he muttered, "I'm the guy you're looking for," and was arrested without a struggle. Craig's defense team argued that his mental health issues, including depression and multiple personality disorders, pushed him to the brink. They claimed he had snapped, unable to control his actions. However, the prosecution painted a much darker picture, one of a man whose actions were chillingly premeditated. To back up their claims, they presented a crucial piece of evidence: Craig's expert psychiatrist testified that while he did suffer from depression, he still had the clear ability to plan the murders. The fact that he spared Sean's life was a key detail, demonstrating that his actions were calculated, not impulsive. 2 years after the murders, the final trial began. Sean, now 12, showed extraordinary bravery as he took the stand to recount the horrifying events. With striking clarity, he described the moment he witnessed his father shoot his mother and the chaos that followed. His testimony left no doubt. Craig's actions weren't a spur-of-the-moment lapse in judgment, but the culmination of months of simmering rage and calculated intent. Sonny also took the stand, shedding light on the abusive relationship between Karen and Craig. She recounted her attempts to protect Karen from Craig's volatile behavior, revealing that he initially appeared unfazed when she and Karen began their relationship. However, his demeanor shifted drastically, becoming hostile only after Karen decided to leave him. However, Sonny also admitted that her testimony was based on memory and what she had heard from Karen without physical evidence to back it up. After just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Craig was guilty of capital murder. His plea of insanity was rejected, leaving him to face the harshest punishments, either the death penalty or life without parole.
Kahler showed no emotion today as he heard his fate. The execution sentence comes as retribution for the shooting deaths of 4 family members.
Court at this time sentences the defendant for the crime of capital murder to death.
James Craig Kahler opted not to speak on his own behalf and even asked if he could leave the room to avoid hearing the victim impact statements. Chief Judge Philip Fromm ordered him to stay.
I loved Grandma White, Karen, Emily, and Lauren very much, and will miss them until the end of my days.
For many in the courtroom, justice had been served, but for Sean, the outcome was far from a relief. Sean, now 12 years old, had already endured unimaginable loss. He stood in court, his voice steady yet filled with emotion, and said, "I do not want my dad to receive the death penalty because it would be hard on my grandparents. I do not want my whole family gone." These words, spoken by a child who had witnessed so much pain, left many stunned. Despite Craig's horrific actions, Sean still saw him as a father, a man who, in his eyes, had been kind and loving to him. Craig, on the other hand, showed no regret for the lives he had taken. After his sentencing, he began writing letters to various people, including the lead prosecutor. These weren't apologies. Instead, Craig claimed he felt relieved by what he had done, insisting that he had freed Sean from what he called a toxic environment. Craig's legal team quickly filed an appeal to the Kansas Supreme Court. They argued that the jury had been biased and claimed that his mental health issues hadn't been properly considered during the trial. But the court disagreed. One judge stated that Kansas law doesn't exonerate someone just because they're mentally ill, and another pointed out that Craig's mental health had been considered during sentencing. It just didn't excuse what he had done. In the end, Craig's appeal was denied. His options for further legal action grew slim, leaving him to face the consequences of his choices. As of now, he remains on death row, a stark reminder of the heinous crimes he committed. Justice may have been served, but it's hard to say if that truly balances the scale for the lives lost. We can only hope he spends his remaining days haunted by his actions, paying for the devastation he caused. As for Sean, his story is one of incredible resilience. Despite the trauma and struggles he endured, he managed to rise above it all. He graduated high school and now works in Kansas, a living testament to strength and perseverance in the face of unimaginable tragedy. His journey inspires hope, proving that even in the darkest times, there's a way forward. But what about this case sticks with you? Do you think this tragedy could have been prevented with the right intervention or support? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This quiet old cabin in the woods seemed like the ultimate summer getaway, a perfect spot for peace and relaxation. But for the Robison family, it became the setting for something straight out of a nightmare. It was the summer of 1968, when this well-off family made headlines everywhere. Not for anything good, but because they fell victim to brutal horrors in the very cabin where they were supposed to be resting. The crime was so horrific that it still shakes the officers and everyone else who knew about the case to this day. What's really interesting is that some investigators and people considered the case solved, yet somehow there's still something missing. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why. To kick things off, let's get to know the Robison family. The Robisons, a family of 6, were well known in Detroit's Lathrop Village, recognized for being both successful and generous. At the head of the family was 42-year-old Richard, a successful advertising executive and the owner of I Impresario magazine. His wife, 40-year-old Shirley, was a devoted homemaker, keeping everything in order at home. Their kids brought a lot of energy to the family dynamic. Their only daughter, 8-year-old Susan, 12-year-old Randall, 16-year-old Gary, and 19-year-old Richie, who was just stepping into adulthood. Now, about 10 years before the tragic summer of 1968, Richard had bought a charming cabin in Good Heart, Michigan, a peaceful, tree-filled area. This secluded spot was the perfect retreat, surrounded by stunning hardwood forests that stretched all the way to the cliffs overlooking Lake Michigan. The cabin was tucked off a scenic lakeshore road, hidden from view, surrounded by luxury lodges that blended seamlessly into the serene landscape. By the 60s, lakefront properties in Good Heart were selling for around $2,400 per foot. Adjusted for inflation, that would be about $21,090 per foot today. This made the area a prime spot for the wealthy and those looking for a private retreat. So you can pretty much guess that the Robison family was part of that same elite group. Although the cabin wasn't completely remote because it had neighbors and a caretaker, it still offered plenty of quiet. Monty Bliss, T.H. caretaker, had built the cabins in 1956 and kept them in good shape ever since. But on June 6, 1968, the family headed out, eager to spend the summer in this peaceful, pricey getaway. Summers at the cabin had become a beloved family tradition for them, and this one was supposed to be no different. Now, before the tragedy, the Robison family didn't just vanish into thin air. In fact, on June 24th that same year, Richard Robison stopped by Monty Bliss's house to offer his condolences after the heartbreaking loss of Bliss's son in a motorcycle accident. During the visit, Richard mentioned that the family planned to be away for a few weeks, traveling to Kentucky and Florida to look for property. Later, a note found on the cabin's front door confirmed they wouldn't be back until July. But then came Tuesday, June 25th. That morning, Richard made a series of phone calls from the cabin, including one to the National Bank of Detroit, asking about a massive $200,000 deposit. Unfortunately, the deposit hadn't come through, a detail that would add to the mystery of what happened next. After that, Richard called his office, where Joseph Scalaro was running things while he was away. What happened next is still a mystery. What we do know is that Richard told a few neighbors they planned to leave for Kentucky and Florida with his family later that day. But as the evening rolled in, a couple living about a quarter-mile away heard something unsettling. Gunshots mixed with raised voices. 2 men and a woman arguing. The woman later recalled, "We heard a series of shots, one with a short pause, then 3 or 4 more. It was still light out, so we thought someone was shooting gulls on the beach." Despite this eerie occurrence, everything seemed normal in the days that followed. Then, on July 22nd, things took a grim turn. A group of women gathered for a bridge party at a nearby cabin began noticing a foul, stomach-turning smell. The odor seemed to come from the Robison family's cabin, so they called Monty Bliss, the caretaker. Since the family had mentioned their trip and hadn't been seen for weeks, no one suspected anything unusual. Bliss initially thought the smell might be a dead raccoon in the crawl space. But as he got closer to the cabin, Bliss noticed something chilling, bullet holes in the windows. Steeling himself for what might be inside, he knocked on the door. When there was no answer, he decided to go in, and what he found was horrific. A woman's body lay just inside the entrance, partially covered with a blanket and her clothes disheveled. Blood pooled around her, and further inside, more bodies were scattered, 3 in the hallway and 2 in one of the bedrooms. Bliss, shaken to his core by what he saw, immediately contacted the authorities. This grim discovery on July 22nd revealed that the Robison family had been dead for 27 days. Bliss later described how he first noticed the cabin's curtains tightly drawn, the front door latched from the inside, and a side door secured with a padlock. Everything seemed locked up tight until the truth came spilling out. When the authorities arrived, they had to use Bliss's keys to get inside the cabin. What they found was just as horrifying as what Bliss had described: 6 bodies, each in different rooms, confirming the worst. Every member of the Robison family was dead. The shattered front window suggested the attack started outside with gunshots before the killer went inside to carry out the rest of the gruesome act. Investigators pieced together that the attack began with 5 shots fired at Richard through a back window using a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle. After that, the killer entered through an unlocked door and used a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol to murder the rest of the family. As if that wasn't horrifying enough, Susan and Richard were savagely beaten with a hammer found at the scene. Shirley and the boys, Richie, Gary, and Randall, were all shot but didn't suffer the same bludgeoning injuries. Then there was the strange stuff. A partially packed suitcase was found, which didn't make sense given their travel plans. The house was still stocked with food, and a deck of cards sat on the table like the family had been in the middle of a game. It was clear they had no idea what was coming. What should have been a peaceful summer getaway turned into a nightmare no one could have imagined. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Going back to the crime scene, investigators believed one person was responsible for the brutal murders, largely because of blood-stained footprints found at the scene. Pathologists determined the family was killed roughly 4 weeks before being discovered, placing the horrific crime on June 25, 1968. The sweltering summer heat had advanced the decomposition of their bodies, making it difficult to examine the injuries thoroughly or gather significant evidence. And let's not forget, this was the 60s, far from the world of high-tech forensic tools we have today. Nevertheless, the details uncovered from the autopsies were as haunting as they come. Shirley, 40 years old, was found in the living room, lying on her stomach and partially covered with a plaid blanket. She'd been shot in the head with a .25 caliber bullet, and investigators believed her body had been staged, hinting at a possible sexually motivated crime. Richard, 42, was discovered in the hallway, sprawled over a hot air register. He'd been shot in the head with a .25 caliber bullet, but it didn't stop there. He also had blunt force trauma and skull fractures. A later autopsy revealed that before the final shot to the head, he'd been hit in the chest with a .22 caliber rifle. Richie, the 19-year-old college student, was found in the northwest bedroom, with part of his body stretched into the hallway. He'd been shot multiple times in the head, all from a .25 caliber weapon. 16-year-old Gary was found lying on his back against the east wall of the same bedroom. He'd been shot twice in the head, both times with a .25 caliber pistol. A later examination revealed he'd also been struck with a .22 caliber bullet and had back injuries. 12-year-old Randall was discovered lying on top of his father on a lavender-colored rug. His cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head, though strangely, no bullet was ever recovered. The youngest, 7-year-old Susan, was found on her back in the hallway, not far from her father. She'd been shot in the face, and a .25 caliber bullet was found in her clothing. Tragically, she also had a skull fracture, likely caused by the hammer found at the scene. At first, the authorities were at a complete loss for a motive behind the Robison family's gruesome murders. By all accounts, they were a loving, church-going family with no known enemies. The kids were well-mannered and academically successful. It begged the haunting question, Who could commit such a horrific act, and why? The first order of business for investigators was to dig into any potential grudges or reasons why the Robisons might have been targeted. Their suspicions quickly turned to Richard Robison, the family patriarch. But here's the twist. If Richard was the intended target, why slaughter the entire family, including 4 children? As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Richard's seemingly picture-perfect life had some cracks beneath the surface. As mentioned earlier, Richard was the owner of Impresario, a magazine that on the outside seemed like a thriving business. But detectives soon learned that his business ventures were entangled in financial struggles. And it didn't stop there. Allegations surfaced that Richard had been running shady practices in his advertising business, allegedly prioritizing his gains over those of his clients. To top it off, rumors of extramarital affairs and inappropriate relationships with his secretaries added even more intrigue. Investigators discovered that over the past 3 years, Richard had scammed clients out of as much as $50,000, charging for ads he never ran or failing to pay for placements. He had also printed full-page airline advertisements in an Impresario without authorization, creating the illusion that his magazine was more successful than it really was. And if you're asking why? Well, Richard had bigger plans, an ambitious, almost fantastical vision of building a global network of computerized warehouses near airports, each doubling as cultural centers. For this, he needed a jaw-dropping $100 million in investments. To further achieve this dream, Richard had aligned himself with a group he called the Superior Table, a supposedly global organization dedicated to world peace and unity. Leading this mysterious group was a figure named Robert, an enigmatic presence who loomed large in Richard's ambitions. Richard even wore a St. Christopher medal inscribed with, "Richard, to my chosen son and heir, God bless you, Robert." But here's where things get murky. It's still unclear whether Robert was a real person or just a figment of Richard's imagination. On the night of the murders, Richard was reportedly expecting someone named Mr. Roberts at the Pellston airport, a name suspiciously similar to Robert. Yet this mysterious figure never showed up. Even stranger, no one from the so-called Superior Table came forward to inquire about the Robison family after the crime. Adding more fuel to the fire, detectives uncovered a peculiar pattern in Richard's behavior. He often checked into airport hotels for days at a time, telling his family he was away on business trips. And this begged the questions: was he meeting with shadowy associates? Was it part of his grand scheme, or was there something much darker and more secretive going on? The spotlight eventually fell on Joseph Scalaro, a 30-year-old employee of Richard Robison. Now remember, Scalaro was the last person Richard had contacted with, and he claimed to have little knowledge about Robison's secretive dealings, suggesting that the airport hotel stays were connected to a new business venture. But here's the twist. During these trips, Robison mostly stayed holed up in his room, with no visitors and no suspicious phone calls. The questions only deepened. Was Robert and the so-called Superior Table real or just an elaborate fabrication? And if Robison was spinning lies, what was he hiding? These mysteries remain unsolved to this day. Adding to the intrigue, whispers of mental health struggles in Richard's past surfaced, though the truth of those claims remains murky. And considering he's now dead, we may never know the truth about his shady dealings, if there were any. Then came a bombshell. Scalaro himself. It turned out he had embezzled a staggering $60,000 from Robison, a sum worth over $140,000 today. Investigators uncovered a string of phone calls between Robison and Scalaro on the very morning of the murders. Police theorized that during one of those calls, Richard confronted Scalaro about the missing money. In a panic, Scalaro allegedly left Detroit, made the hours-long drive to Goodhart, and silenced Robison before he could expose the fraud. Circumstantial evidence seems to back up this theory. For starters, Joseph was completely off the grid for a 12-hour stretch on the day of the murders. He didn't contact anyone, friends, business associates, or family, and had no alibi to confirm his whereabouts. Joseph claimed he was at a plumbing convention and meeting clients, but no one could verify his story. But even with this, some parts of the case remain murky. The drive from Detroit to Good Heart usually takes about 5 to 6 hours, yet gunshots rang out around 9 p.m. on the night of the murders. Joseph's wife later provided an alibi, saying he was at home in Birmingham around 11 p.m., which throws a huge wrench into the timeline. This inconsistency left investigators scratching their heads. But as the investigation continued, more holes appeared in Joseph's story. The authorities focused on his alibi, particularly regarding the time of the murders. Joseph initially told the police that his last conversation with Robison was on June 25, 1968, when Robison had asked about some company checks. However, further digging revealed that Joseph had recently given himself a big pay raise, boosted his expense account, and even handed out raises to other employees, all without Robison's approval. When they looked at some of Robison's pre-signed checks, they discovered Joseph had been inflating the amounts in the weeks leading up to the murders. At the crime scene, detectives found shell casings and blood-soaked footprints that pointed to the killer's presence. The investigation took another twist when they found a pair of shoes in Joseph's possession that perfectly matched the prints left behind. The catch? The shoes were spotless, clearly never worn. This was a tricky detail for the police since it didn't directly link Joseph to the crime scene, but it raised more questions. It turned out that Joseph had a habit of buying duplicate items, so the police speculated that he might have used the other pair for the murders. To make matters worse for Joseph, he failed 2 polygraph tests, and the results from a third were inconclusive. Following the brutal killings of the Robison family, Joseph suddenly found himself in control of the business, adding a final layer of suspicion. But this wasn't the only piece of the puzzle that pointed toward his involvement. Investigators uncovered that Scolaro owned a firearm, which, while not an exact match, bore certain similarities to the weapon believed to have been used in the murders. The 2 key firearms central to the case were a .25 caliber Beretta automatic pistol and a rare .22 caliber Armalite AR-7 rifle. Police records showed that Scolaro owned 2 of each, and he claimed that he had given 1 pistol to Robison and donated both rifles. But things took a dramatic turn in 1969 when witness testimonies led detectives to a private shooting range owned by Scolaro's father-in-law. It turned out that Scolaro, a former military marksman, frequented the range. There, they made a breakthrough discovery: AR-7 shell casings that perfectly matched those recovered at the crime scene. This finding was confirmed by a state police lab report, giving law enforcement the conclusive evidence they had been searching for. So in December of 1969, over a year after the murder of the Robison family, investigators presented their case to the county prosecutor, hoping to bring charges against Joseph Scolaro. However, without the murder weapons or any eyewitnesses, the prosecutor decided not to move forward, deeming the evidence as circumstantial and insufficient for a conviction. The case went cold, but the detectives didn't give up. They continued to work with prosecutors from Emmett County, where the crime occurred, and from Oakland County, where the Robison family lived, pushing to keep the investigation alive. 4 years later, in 1973, a new prosecutor, Lewis Brooks Patterson, took a fresh look at the Robison case and was prepared to pursue charges against Scolaro for conspiracy to commit murder. But just as things seemed to be heading toward a breakthrough, disaster struck. On March 8, 1973, 2 individuals entered Scolaro's office to collect a debt of $730. Instead, they found Scolaro dead in his chair, a gunshot wound to his skull, and a picture frame shattered on the wall. Police quickly arrived at the scene, confirming that Scolaro had taken his own life with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The prosecutor's pursuit of justice came to an abrupt halt. On Scolaro's desk was a note, chilling in its admission. It read, "Mother, where do I start? I am a liar, cheat, phony. Any check that any of the people have with your signature isn't any good because I forged your name to it to get them off my back. I know I'm sick, but seeking help isn't going to help the people I've hurt." He added a postscript. "I had nothing to do with the Robisons. I'm a cheat, but not a murderer." But even with this statement, the case surrounding Joseph Scalaro remained full of mystery. While he insisted on his innocence, many, including the state police and the Emmett County Sheriff's Department, still viewed him as the prime suspect. No charges were ever filed against him, and with his death, the opportunity to ever get the full truth out of him vanished for good. Now things took another strange turn when, on the night of his death, an anonymous caller reached out to the detective working on the case. But it wasn't the detective who answered the phone. It was his high school-aged son. The mysterious caller simply said, "Just tell him Joe called and that he was right." The detective believed this message was likely tied to something he had told Scalaro before. "You're a good Catholic boy. It's going to eat at you until you confess." So, was Scalaro finally feeling guilty, or was this just another piece of the puzzle he'd never fully admitted to? But here's where things get even more tangled. Scalaro isn't the only name that comes up when it comes to the murders of Richard Robison and his family. Some people argue that the idea of Scalaro committing these murders doesn't quite add up. After all, it would have been nearly impossible for him to drive all the way from Detroit to Good Heart, kill the Robisons, and get back to Detroit in the time he was supposedly unaccounted for. So, was he the one who did it? Or is there another suspect? Enter John Norman Collins, a name tied to a whole different string of unsolved murders. Collins was linked to a series of killings between 1967 and 1969 in southeastern Michigan, where young teenage girls were abducted, SAE'd, and brutally murdered. He was convicted of one murder in 1970, but many believe he could have been behind other killings, making him the infamous Michigan murderer. What makes things even more interesting is Collins' connection to the Robison case. He knew Richie, the Robison family's eldest son. Both had attended the same university in eastern Michigan. But despite this connection, there's no clear reason why Collins would have targeted the Robisons. His usual victims didn't fit this profile, and there's no evidence that links him directly to the crime. As a result, many dismiss him as a credible suspect. Additionally, there are whispers around the involvement of Monty Bliss, the caretaker of Blisswood, the cabin where the Robison family's bodies were discovered. Bliss was no stranger to the property. He had a hand in building the cabin and knew the area well. Some locals in Good Heart even speculate that Bliss might have had a motive for the murders, suggesting that grief over his son's tragic motorcycle accident, which occurred shortly before the family's death, may have pushed him to seek revenge. According to this theory, Bliss, feeling wronged by Richard Robison in the wake of his son's death, took matters into his own hands. But while this theory seems plausible on the surface, it's important to note that the police never seriously considered Monty Bliss a suspect. A revenge killing fueled by grief is an understandable narrative, but it doesn't quite fit the facts of the case. And just when you think the theories can't get any crazier, here's another jaw-dropper. One theory suggests that Robison's former secretary, who later married a wealthy manufacturing mogul with rumored mafia connections in Cleveland, might be wrapped up in this mystery. Around the time of the murders, this woman had a miscarriage, and the gossip mill started churning with whispers that the baby might have been Robison's, not her 70-year-old husband's. And as if that wasn't enough, some people speculated that a family tied to one of Robison's botched business deals could have had mafia links. Marty Joe Link, the author of Up When Evil Came to Good Heart, doesn't shut down the mob theory, even saying it certainly has some validity. The weapon used in the murders, an AR-7 rifle, was considered a novelty weapon, but it was also a favorite among mafia hitmen at the time. In a shocking twist, an informant in 1968 claimed Robison owed the mob $12,000 a month and was way behind on payments. The informant even quoted someone saying, "If he hadn't withheld payments like he did, we wouldn't have wiped out the entire family." These mafia ties definitely add another layer of suspicion to the whole case. But just when the investigation hit a dead end after Scalaro's death, something strange happened. In February 1974, a state trooper found a blue 1965 Chevrolet abandoned by the side of the M14 highway. Inside the glove box, a luggage tag with the name Shirley L. Robison, Lathrop Village, Michigan. This was 200 miles away from the crime scene and 6 years after the murders. The investigators scoured the car for clues but found nothing useful. A title search revealed the car had passed through multiple owners since it was first purchased in 1966, but none of the previous owners had any idea how the luggage tag ended up in the car. Another mysterious dead end. Over the years, people have questioned why the main suspect was never charged. Some believe that Emmett County didn't want to deal with the massive costs of a trial. Others have wondered if the prosecutor had the chops to secure a conviction. Fast forward 45 years, and Detective Sergeant Jim Linderman of the Emmett County Sheriff's Office finally took over the case. Linderman explained that when a detective retires, their successor automatically takes over any unresolved cases. He mentioned that a good chunk of his evidence room is still packed with items from this case, which he calls the most critical unsolved case in the county. He and his team are still hoping for a resolution. Then, in 2018, to mark the 50th anniversary of the murders, retired investigators teamed up with a local historian and author to hold a community forum about the case. They dropped a bombshell. The mystery wasn't as mysterious as everyone thought. They confirmed that the primary suspect, the one who took his own life in 1973, just as the authorities were about to arrest him, was, in fact, the man responsible for the murders. Well, considering all the clues, it's not too hard to believe that Scalaro could have been the killer. But what do you think? Do you think he was really the one behind it? Or is there someone else who might have been involved? Maybe the mafia theory is more convincing. I want to hear your thoughts.
I have never heard anything as bad as the Kapunda triple murder. There is simply no comparison.
I mean, like, they were just good people. I just don't understand why someone would do this.
This question haunts us every time a murder leaves the world in shock, and this case is no exception. In fact, it's even more disturbing. In the normally peaceful town of Kapunda, where crime is almost unheard of, something unspeakable happened. And trust me when I say, even the most hardened investigators called this one of the most savage, blood-soaked cases a jury had ever seen. It was so brutal that when the killer was finally caught, the grieving family had just one thing to say.
I hope he goes to hell. I don't give a shit what happens to him.
So what really happened for them to say this? And could this be a case where a life for a life should be on the table? I'll leave that question for you to answer by the end of this video. In the meantime, let's get to know the victims first. For this case, let's take a step back to the fall of 2010, to a small, tranquil town in South Australia called Kapunda. With a population of just 3,000 people, it sat peacefully near the Light River in the Barossa Valley, a place where the world seemed to move a little slower. Here, in the heart of this quiet town, the Rowe family was living their lives. The head of the family, Andrew Rowe, was born in England in 1965. But when he was just 3 years old, Andrew and his parents packed up and moved to Australia, where they decided to put down roots. They settled in a quiet suburb of Adelaide, and it was there that Andrew grew up. As a kid, he was known for his friendly personality, his great sense of humor, and his love for fishing with his dad. He was the kind of guy you'd want as a neighbor, always smiling and willing to lend a hand. As he got older, Andrew's path crossed with a young woman named Rose. She was a cheerful, vibrant spirit, just a year younger than him. They met while Andrew was studying in Adelaide, and it didn't take long for sparks to fly. Their relationship quickly blossomed into something serious. In 1985, the two of them married in a small ceremony surrounded by close friends and family, just the kind of intimate celebration they both wanted. 2 years later, in 1987, Andrew and Rose welcomed their first child, a son they named Christopher. Their family was complete when, in 1994, they had their second child, a beautiful daughter named Chantel. Life in Kapunda seemed perfect. Andrew and Rose decided to start their own carpet cleaning business, and the business quickly thrived, providing the family with financial stability. By the summer of 2010, Christopher, now 23, had moved out of the family home and was living with his girlfriend just a few blocks away. Meanwhile, 16-year-old Chantel had started working part-time as a waitress at a local roadside cafe, juggling work with school. But life wasn't always smooth sailing. Around this time, Chantel faced a big challenge. She discovered she was pregnant. At such a young age, and with her boyfriend Dylan by her side, she was faced with many obstacles. However, Chantel wasn't one to back down. Despite the hardships, she was determined to give her baby the best life possible. And though she was only 16, she had an unwavering support system. Dylan, her boyfriend, stood by her every step of the way, offering his love and commitment. Her friends, too, were there for her, ready to offer their help and encouragement no matter what. Life in the Rowe family was, for the most part, good. There were challenges, of course, but there was also love, hope, and a sense of family. That is, until the night of November 7th, 2010, the night that would change everything. It was midnight when an intruder broke into the Rowe family home and brutally murdered them in a way so savage it shocked even the most experienced detectives from Adelaide. Inside, the house looked like something straight out of a horror movie. Blood was everywhere, on the floor, walls, curtains, and even the ceiling. But it wasn't until 2 days later that anyone noticed something was terribly wrong. The neighbors, who hadn't seen any movement from the family in days, started peeking through the windows. And what they found was horrifying. The bodies of 45-year-old Andrew and 44-year-old Rose were discovered in the kitchen, horribly disfigured, while Chantel's body was found in her bedroom, torn apart. Each family member had suffered multiple stab wounds and had been dead for days before the police arrived. At the time of the murders, Christopher, the eldest son, was away on vacation with his fiancée in Queensland. When word of the horrific crime started to spread, he heard that dead bodies had been found on the very street where his family lived. In a panic, he rushed to ask anyone he could on Facebook for more details, desperately trying to confirm the terrible news. What made the situation even worse was that he couldn't get in touch with his family. Initially, he was told it wasn't his parents, but soon after, the police confirmed his worst nightmare. They broke the heartbreaking news to him over the phone. When the autopsy results were revealed, it shattered Christopher even more. The total number of stab wounds was staggering, around 112 in total. His father, Andrew, had been stabbed 29 times, his mother, Rose, more than 50 times, and his sister, Chantel, 33 times. The worst part? Chantel had been assaulted before her life was brutally taken, leaving Christopher with an unthinkable amount of grief and loss. But as strange as it sounds, the first person suspected of the crime was Christopher himself, mainly because he was the only surviving family member at the time. However, he was ruled out as a suspect immediately, as he was the first to raise the alarm when he couldn't get in touch with his family. Once he heard the devastating news, he quickly flew back home. His alibi and fingerprints were checked, confirming he was across the continent when the murders occurred. So, who could have been twisted enough to murder 3 adults in such a brutal way? The Rowe family was well liked in their town, with no known enemies. Who would have wanted to harm them? At this point, people were desperate for answers, especially Chantel's friends. Why would someone attack a pregnant teenager? The brutality of the crime was horrifying enough, but then an eerie detail surfaced that made it even more disturbing. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Investigators pieced together that after the murders, the killer had calmly changed into clean clothes and laid down on Chantel's bed. Bloody drag marks near the bed revealed that Chantel had desperately tried to hide, but the killer had dragged her out, refusing to let her escape. Additionally, nothing was stolen. Valuables like phones, a laptop, an expensive camera, and even cash were left untouched in plain sight. This ruled out robbery as a motive. The sheer brutality of the attack also suggested that more than one person might have been involved, as it would have been difficult for a single individual to overpower 3 adults. Alternatively, the perpetrator could have been a physically strong man. Investigators also noticed that the suspect had clumsily attempted to clean the crime scene, wiping away footprints in some areas before abandoning the effort. Bloody shoe prints led to the door, but then suddenly stopped, implying that the killer may have removed his shoes and left in socks to avoid leaving more evidence. Even more chilling, there were no signs of forced entry, meaning the family likely knew the killer and willingly let him inside, or he had found another way to enter. Now, as mentioned earlier, forensic experts confirmed that Chantel had been sexually assaulted before her death, making the crime even more twisted and deeply personal. But the most gut-wrenching revelation was about Rose, the mother. She had been stabbed more than 50 times, far more than Chantel or Andrew. The reason? She had survived the first attack and managed to call for help. But before she could get assistance, the killer realized she was still alive and came back for her, stabbing her repeatedly until she could no longer fight back. With all this being said, the police began to look at every possible suspect, but after confirming that the parents had no enemies or personal issues that could have led to this horrifying crime, they quickly shifted their focus to their 16-year-old daughter, Chantel. Chantel and her boyfriend, Dylan, had been together for a year, and with a baby on the way, they were both still attending the same school. Like Chantel, Dylan was only 16, and at first glance, he didn't seem capable of such a horrific crime. But the police had to be thorough. They needed to question him, check his alibi, and see if he had any idea who might have wanted to hurt Chantel or her family. Dylan was more than willing to cooperate. Heartbroken, he told investigators about his loving relationship with Chantel and how they had even talked about getting married in the future. He was devastated by her death and struggling to process what had happened. At the time of the murders, Dylan was in a nearby city attending his grandfather's anniversary, and his alibi was rock solid. Dozens of witnesses confirmed his whereabouts, officially ruling him out as a suspect. Despite having few solid leads, the police did have one major advantage: the killer's DNA and fingerprints. They had extracted seminal fluid from Chantel's body, which could be the key to identifying the murderer. But when they ran it through their database, there was no match, meaning whoever did this had no prior criminal record. Another chilling detail emerged: the murderer had used knives from the family's own kitchen. This hinted that the attack might not have been planned in advance, but was instead an impulsive act of extreme violence. To make things even harder for investigators, the killer took the murder weapons with him, leaving behind almost no physical evidence. Forensic experts estimated the time of death between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning. A neighbor later admitted to hearing Rose scream for help twice around 1 o'clock, followed by a loud thud. Unfortunately, they assumed it was just a domestic dispute and didn't call the police. No one reported seeing any strangers near the house that night, and officers carefully combed the area, searching for clues or the missing weapons. Hoping for a breakthrough, the police turned to the public, asking anyone with information to come forward. Tips poured in, but most were either misleading or completely false, making the investigation even more frustrating. Hoping for a breakthrough, police turned to the public, urging anyone with information to come forward. Calls flooded in, but most were dead ends, false leads, wild theories, and outright hoaxes. The frustration grew, but then Dylan shared something that sent chills down investigators' spines. He remembered that on Sunday night, Chantel wasn't feeling well. She had developed a fever and even called her boss to say she'd be missing work. The next morning, at exactly 5 o'clock, Dylan sent her a text to check in. His message was read, but there was no reply. What he didn't know was that by then, Chantel and her parents were already dead. The person who had read his message wasn't her, it was the killer. Then came an even more disturbing twist. Police discovered the murderer had actually tried to respond to Dylan's text, but Chantel's phone was out of credit. It was a failed attempt to fake her being alive. With this eerie revelation, detectives dug deeper, focusing on Chantel's circle and anyone with a potential grudge. That's when they stumbled upon Jason Alexander Downey, a 17-year-old who was close with Dylan but barely knew Chantel. At first, Jason didn't seem like a threat. He was average height, thin, and appeared harmless. Police initially planned to ask him a few questions and move on. But as the interview progressed, his behavior took a strange turn. Instead of answering questions directly, he grew more nervous, raising the detectives' suspicions. He complained about not being invited to Chantel's party and pointed out that everyone else had a partner, even though it wasn't relevant to the case. Then, he suddenly claimed to have an alibi for the night of the murders, a statement no one had even asked for. This erratic behavior only intensified the police's suspicions, prompting them to take his fingerprints and DNA. To their surprise, Jason cooperated calmly, showing little anxiety, something that made them briefly question if their suspicions were wrong. But the truth came out when experts examined his fingerprints. They noticed fresh, deep cuts on Jason's palms, and though he claimed they were from a machine shop accident, the cuts looked too clean and precise, as if made by something sharp. But then, the smoking gun emerged. The fingerprints found on Chantel's bedroom door matched Jason's, and within just 2 days, the DNA results confirmed what everyone had been dreading. Jason Downey was responsible for the brutal murders. Contrary to what police first assumed, that the killer had to be big and strong to take down 3 adults, Jason was actually thin and looked completely harmless. A chilling reminder that you should never judge a book by its cover. He even managed to deceive many people, even those closest to him. When the family's relatives and friends gathered to pay their respects, Jason was seen on local news laying flowers for the family, looking every bit the part of a grieving friend. Born in Kilmarnock, Scotland, Jason had moved to Kapunda with his mother and older brother Jamie. On the surface, his background seemed normal enough, but beneath it all, there was a dark side to Jason that only he and Chantel truly knew. As it turns out, Chantel had always been polite to Jason, but their connection was nothing special. She didn't dislike him, but she didn't really like him either. He was just part of the group, someone she tolerated out of necessity. The thing was, Jason didn't take rejection well. She had turned down his advances multiple times, but instead of accepting it, Jason's feelings began to morph into something darker, more dangerous. And when he found out that Chantel was pregnant with Dylan's baby, it was like a switch flipped in his mind. The thought of his friend, Dylan, being the father, not him, sent Jason into a jealousy-fueled rage. That rage came to a head on the night of November 7th. But there's a dark twist to his reasoning. Jason wasn't just angry at Dylan. It wasn't even about him as much as it was about Chantel. The jealousy and obsession had reached a boiling point, and the night would mark the beginning of something tragic. When Jason was first questioned about the murders after his arrest, his calm demeanor shocked the detectives. He denied everything with unsettling ease, trying to talk his way out of the evidence piling up against him. He claimed that his fingerprints at the Rowe family home weren't from the night of the murders, but from a visit a month and a half earlier. A simple slip-up, right? Except when the police dug deeper, they found that his DNA was on Chantel's body. Jason tried to play it off, making up an outlandish story that during that same visit, he and Chantel had been intimate. But here's where his lies fell apart: the forensic evidence. It proved that the DNA found on Chantel couldn't have stayed on her body for that long. It was impossible. That lie was just another nail in his coffin. Jason's confession revealed a disturbing series of events that painted a chilling picture of the night. After a heated argument with his mother and stepfather, Jason decided to sleep in his car. But that's when things took a turn. He found out from Dylan that Chantel was home, sick. And suddenly, Jason's obsession hit a whole new level. What started as a plan to simply drive by and glance at her house morphed into something far more sinister. So, Jason parked his car at the end of the street, out of sight, and walked toward the Rowe family home. The house was dark, the windows all closed. But there was one window, the bathroom window, slightly ajar. Being the thin, nimble guy he was, Jason squeezed right through it without hesitation. Once inside, he sat quietly in the bathroom for about 30 minutes, just listening, waiting for the house to settle, ensuring that everyone was asleep. Now, Jason claims his initial plan was to confess his feelings to Chantel, but let's be real. Why would he grab a kitchen knife before entering her room? Investigators knew right away this wasn't just some awkward confession. Jason had far darker intentions. Police believed that he was going to threaten her, to control her in the twisted way his obsession demanded. When he finally entered Chantel's room, she resisted his advances. And that's when everything snapped. Her rejection triggered a violent fury in him, and in that moment, Jason didn't hold back. He brutally stabbed her over and over. The screams from Chantel woke her parents, Andrew and Rose, who rushed to protect their daughter. But Jason, now fully consumed by rage, turned on them as well, stabbing both Andrew and Rose to death in a frenzy. In his confession, Jason claimed he acted out of an uncontrollable passion, but the cold, calculated nature of his actions painted a different picture. This whole picture suggested premeditation rather than a spur-of-the-moment crime. As the investigation progressed, more damning evidence surfaced, further tightening the noose around Jason. A pair of blood-stained shoes were discovered discarded in a deserted area. The blood on them matched the DNA of all three victims, and the prints from the soles matched the bloody footprints found at the crime scene. Inside the shoes, traces of Jason's sweat were also found, implicating him even further. Despite his attempts to cooperate, like promising to show investigators where he had disposed of the knives, the murder weapons were never recovered. This led detectives to believe that Jason was still trying to manipulate the situation, even as the evidence piled up against him. The trial of Jason Downey finally came in the fall of 2011, nearly a year after the murders. Throughout the trial, he remained cold and emotionless, frequently changing his testimony and showing no remorse for his actions. He continued to claim he had no memory of killing the Rowe family, even though his actions told a much darker story. One chilling detail that emerged during the trial was that after the massacre, Jason took Chantel's pendant and chain, a piece of her he kept even after her death. During the trial, Jason even argued that the tragedy could have been avoided if Chantel had simply invited him to the party she had hosted before her death. It was clear, though, that his deep feelings of rejection and obsession with her had pushed him to commit this unspeakable act. Throughout the proceedings, Jason maintained a calm, indifferent demeanor. When he finally pleaded guilty, it was an attempt to secure a lighter sentence. He later admitted to his brother that this was his reasoning, to avoid life imprisonment without the possibility of parole.
Hateful things went through your mind.
Downey refusing to even glance their way.
I just don't think he shows any remorse for what he's done.
Even police stunned at the sheer savagery of the crime and the killer's attitude since.
His guilty plea shouldn't be seen as any sign of remorse on his part for three murders that I think are unrivaled in their cruel and savage nature.
On April 19, 2012, Jason Downey was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years. Had he not pleaded guilty, he would have had to serve at least 45 years before even being eligible for parole. He even wrote a letter addressed to Chantel's family and friends, stating he was sorry and that he deserved whatever punishment came his way. But when you take a closer look at Jason's letter, it's hard to ignore the sense that there's no genuine remorse behind his words. It almost feels like a forced apology, like a boy who was made to write it rather than someone who truly regrets his actions. Chantel's brother, Christopher Rowe, who tragically lost his entire family, expressed that while he believed the sentence was just, no punishment could ever heal the pain of losing his loved ones. To honor their memory, Christopher had their names tattooed on his body, a permanent tribute to the family he lost. In one interview, Christopher couldn't even bring himself to speak directly to the press, so he let his cousin speak on his behalf.
The lives of my dad, mum and sister were viciously taken by someone of sound mind. Qualifies this bastard, Jason Downey, to only 35 years of non-parole, whilst my family and I continue to serve life. Please explain to me the justice in this.
Christopher, is there anything you'd like to say at all?
That's all, thanks.
After the tragedy, he took 6 months off work and left Kapunda, retreating from the world. When he returned, he could barely keep interest in his work. However, he eventually took over his dad's carpet cleaning business, changing the name from First Choice Carpet Cleaning to Rowe's Choice Carpet Cleaning, a way to keep his family's legacy alive while rebuilding his own life. As for Jason, he remains at the Moreland Juvenile Detention Center in South Australia, still serving his sentence.
In 1987, the bodies of these 14 people were discovered inside the home of Ronald Gene Simmons. But the nightmare didn't end there. What followed became one of the most shocking and haunting massacres in Arkansas history.
In Arkansas, investigators continue to look into one of the nation's worst cases of mass murder.
Ronald Gene Simmons was already known for being violent, but nothing prepared anyone for the horrifying truths that would shake Arkansas from 1987 all the way to today. And when I say haunting, I mean every single detail is chilling. So if stories about incest, abuse, and murder aren't your thing, you might want to think twice, because this is one case you will never forget.
He looked at me with that gun and pointed that gun on me. He had this just horrid grin on his face. And he looked mad. He just looked mad, and like a mad dog would look at you.
A mad dog, a recluse, a weirdo, and a nice guy. All descriptions of this man. So far, Gene Simmons has said nothing to police, showed no emotion, except at the mention of family.
Long before the headlines, before the horror that would shock the country, there was just a boy, angry, restless, and already on a path that no one could have predicted. Ronald Gene Simmons wasn't born a monster, but life certainly didn't hand him peace. He came into the world on July 15th, 1940, in Chicago, Illinois, during a time of war and change. But it didn't take long for things to fall apart. When Ronald was just a toddler, tragedy struck. His father, William Simmons, died suddenly of a stroke. A devastating loss like that can shake any child, but Ronald didn't get much time to grieve. Within a year, his mother remarried. Her new husband, William D. Griffin, worked as a civil engineer for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. That meant one thing: constant moving. The family bounced from town to town across Arkansas, never settling long enough for Ronald to make friends or feel grounded. To a young boy craving stability, these never-ending changes planted seeds of frustration, loneliness, and rage. He never quite fit in. He was the new kid too many times to count. Eventually, he gave up on trying. Instead of making connections, Ronald turned cold. He lashed out at classmates and earned a reputation as a bully. Teachers couldn't handle him. Students avoided him. By his teens, his home life was just as rocky. His behavior spiraled, and no matter how hard his parents tried, whether it was strict rules or desperate guidance, nothing stuck. Ronald was out of control, so at 16, his parents made a last-ditch move. They enrolled him in military school, hoping structure would do what they couldn't. Surprisingly, it worked. The harsh rules, the discipline, the chain of command. It gave Ronald something he lacked his entire life: control. For once, he followed the rules, maybe not because he believed in them, but because they gave him power. When he graduated on September 15, 1957, the military felt like the next logical step. So, without hesitation, he enlisted in the United States Navy. His first post was at Naval Station Bremerton in Washington, where something unexpected happened. He met someone. Her name was Rebecca Becky Ulibarri. Maybe he saw in her the kind of stability he never had, or maybe it was just another thing he wanted to control. Either way, the relationship moved fast. On July 9, 1960, the two tied the knot in New Mexico, and just like that, Ronald began a new chapter. At first glance, Ronald and Becky might have looked like your average military couple, married young, raising a growing family, moving with the flow of duty. But inside their home, a much darker story was unfolding. The man Becky had married was not the same man she now lived with. The longer he wore the uniform, the more rigid, controlling, and unrelenting he became. Ronald demanded absolute perfection. He wasn't just strict, he was obsessive. The house had to be spotless at all times. Becky's appearance had to be exactly the way he wanted it. From her clothes to the way she styled her hair, everything was under his thumb. And so, for 18 long and painful years, Becky stayed. Together they had 9 children: Ronald Gene Simmons Jr., Sheila Simmons, William Billy Simmons, Loretta Simmons, Eddie Simmons, Marianne Simmons, Rebecca Simmons. Now, after leaving the Navy in 1963, he didn't slow down. He joined the United States Air Force a couple of years later, but the uniform couldn't fix what was broken. His temper was volcanic, and his obsession with power only grew. What started as cruelty toward Becky eventually turned into something even more disturbing. He extended that same brutality to his children. He didn't discipline them, he ruled them. Every task had to be done his way, and if it wasn't, the punishment was swift and terrifying. Ronald saw any form of defiance, no matter how small, as betrayal. He didn't guide his kids, he dominated them. His house wasn't a home, it was a prison where he held the keys. But amid all the terror, one child seemed to get special treatment: his daughter Sheila. At first, it looked like favoritism. Ronald spent more time with her, gave her more freedom, more privileges. But it didn't take long for that favoritism to feel off. Too close, too intense, too unnatural. And then came the day no one could ever forget. He called a family meeting, stood in front of everyone with the coldness of a man announcing the weather, and dropped a bomb that shattered what little was left of their family. Sheila was pregnant, and Ronald was the father. There was no shame in his voice, no guilt, no hesitation. He declared that Sheila would carry the child to term, raise it in their home, and that everyone in the family was expected to accept it, just like that. As if this wasn't horrifying, as if incest and abuse were just facts of life under his roof. Becky said nothing. She had been emotionally destroyed over the years, beaten down so badly she couldn't even find her voice. But someone else in the family did speak up. Ronald Jr., Sheila's older brother, couldn't stay silent. He was disgusted and terrified, and he took action the moment he could. He went straight to his sister's school and told a counselor everything. At first, Sheila denied it all, said she wasn't pregnant, that nothing happened. But the school staff knew something wasn't right. They kept digging, kept asking, and after nearly a month, Sheila broke. Through tears and unbearable shame, she finally confessed the truth. Her own father had gotten her pregnant. And here's where things take an even darker turn. Ronald wasn't just some abusive man hiding in the shadows. He was a decorated military veteran with over 2 decades of service. He had earned honors like the Air Force Ribbon for excellent marksmanship, the Vietnam Gallantry Cross, and even the Bronze Star Medal, a medal given for heroism and meritorious service. On November 30th, 1979, He left the Air Force with the rank of Master Sergeant. To the outside world, he looked like a war hero, but beneath that shiny surface was a man who had built a kingdom of terror inside his own home. And that kingdom was about to fall apart. The first real breakthrough came when the Department of Human Services in Cloudcroft, New Mexico, launched an official investigation on April 3rd, 1981. But instead of facing the music, Ronald did what so many cowards do. He ran. Ronald first fled with his family to Ward, Arkansas. By the end of September, on the 30th to be exact, he landed a temporary gig as a filing clerk in the Medical Records Department at the John L. McClellan Memorial Veterans Hospital in North Little Rock. Just a few months later, on January 10th of 1982, he managed to snag a permanent position as a personnel clerk at the 5th Army Medical Recruiting Battalion in Little Rock. But while Ronald tried to blend into a new life, his home was slowly falling apart. His son William wanted nothing to do with the move and stayed back in New Mexico with his high school friends. And Becky? After the incest accusation surfaced, she was done, emotionally checked out and no longer sharing a bed with Ronald. Still in Ward, Ronald did the unthinkable again. He got his daughter Sheila pregnant for the second time. The pregnancy didn't go to term. In early 1983, it was terminated by Dr. Chu Ai-tan in Dermot. Then, on June 12th of that same year, the family bought a small, isolated farm, too far from Little Rock to commute, as Ronald put it. It was 14 acres of rough land in Pope County, a little over 6 miles north of Dover. They called it Mockingbird Hill, a name that would come to haunt them. Ronald quit his recruiting job that August and retreated into their new hideout, far from society's eyes. Part of the reason for the move, Sheila had started seeing a young guy named Dennis McNulty, whom she met at the Draffon School of Business. She was studying to be a secretary, and Dennis was into radio communications. The distance didn't scare Dennis one bit. He regularly made the grueling 170-mile round trips to see her, determined to keep their relationship alive despite the family's eerie isolation. Mockingbird Hill sat on a low ridge near Arkansas Highway 7 in the tiny blink-and-you'll-miss-it community of Pleasant Grove. The surroundings? A church, a graveyard, a corner store, and a campground. Bare bones, just how Ronald liked it. Within 2 days of moving in, he hammered a no trespassing sign into the dirt and started wrapping the property in barbed wire, cutting his family off from the outside world. Their home was a 5-bedroom mobile unit, with 2 extra rooms squeezed under an extended roof. The living room was cozy enough with its fireplace, but everything else, from the kitchen to the bedrooms, was tight and cramped. The heating and AC, basically non-existent. They had a single wood-burning stove for warmth, and only one window unit to battle the summer heat. There was a phone on the property, but Ronald refused to let anyone hook it up. No calls in, no calls out. He wanted full control. The plumbing was a joke, too. No working bathrooms inside, just 2 outhouses outside. To make matters even weirder, Ronald built a tall, makeshift privacy fence around the place. Some parts of it shot up 10 feet high. And just before Christmas, he told the family to dig a new privy pit in the yard. What they didn't know then was that this pit would become a grave for secrets far darker than they could imagine. Meanwhile, William was trying to patch things up with his estranged wife, Wilma. The plan was to have their 3-year-old daughter, Barbara, stay at Mockingbird Hill temporarily while he and Wilma figured things out. They were even planning to remarry in February of 1988. William arrived at the farm on December 21st, but Wilma had to stay behind in New Mexico for Christmas. Money was too tight for the trip. Back at the farm, Ronald had become a shadow of himself, sinking deeper into isolation. He locked himself away in his bedroom, his private chamber that no one, not even Becky, dared enter. Her sister, Edith Nesby, would later recall that Ronald kept the door locked whether he was inside or not. He was quiet, stingy, and had a dead-eyed stare that could freeze a person in their tracks. Even his kids were afraid of him. He made them do pointless, punishing tasks, like hauling 5-gallon buckets of dirt up steep hills for no reason. 17-year-old Loretta once told a classmate her father was just a drunken bum, always gripping a beer, always disappearing into that foul-smelling room no one else could enter. Now, as mentioned earlier, Ronald was once a force to be reckoned with, thanks to his military achievements. But when he entered civilian life, he found himself taking lowly jobs that bruised his ego. Then, by some twist of fate, he landed a clerk position at a local legal office. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually pull himself together. His punctuality and rigid discipline impressed the higher-ups. But underneath that well-dressed surface, the same darkness lingered, and it exploded when he made unwanted sexually charged advances toward a female co-worker. The illusion shattered. Thankfully, the woman had the courage to speak up. Ronald was fired on the spot. But instead of facing the consequences, he rewrote the story in his mind, convincing himself he was the victim, that he was entitled to a woman's attention, and that women were out to destroy him. To Ronald, women weren't people. They were objects, to control or to discard. Not long after, he found another job at Woodline Motor Freight Company. He promised himself he'd behave, especially around female co-workers. Outwardly, he kept his distance. Inwardly, his resentment festered. He despised women. He despised the civilian world. He missed the strict rules and rank of the military, the instant respect, the control. Now he was just another nobody in a town that didn't know his name, answering to people he didn't respect, and worse, couldn't control. And then came Joyce Elaine Butts, his new boss. A woman. For Ronald, this was intolerable. Taking orders from a woman who wasn't afraid of him drove him into a rage. He became openly insubordinate and downright hostile. It didn't take long before he was fired again. But in his twisted mind, he still wasn't the problem. He blamed the women of Arkansas for his downfall, believing they were sabotaging him out of spite. He never stopped to consider that maybe it was his own hatred and violence that drove people away. By then, the once bustling Simmons household was beginning to thin out. The kids were growing up and leaving. Jean, the eldest, had married and moved out before the family even left New Mexico. Sheila, who had survived years of unspeakable trauma under Ronald's roof, had also married and was raising her daughter Sylvia, the child fathered by her own father. William had secured a managerial job at Hardee's and married Renata May, building a new life in Fordyce. Loretta, a brilliant honors student, was nearing graduation. Her diary and whispered admissions revealed a single dream: escape. Everyone could see it in her eyes. She was counting down the days. But Christmas was around the corner, and for Ronald Simmons, that wasn't a time for joy. It was an opportunity. Becky Simmons had sent out cards that December, stuffing them with handwritten letters filled with excitement. Her entire family would finally be together, all the kids, all the grandkids under one roof. It was meant to be a real celebration. But while Becky envisioned joy, Ronald had already begun planning something far more sinister. Weeks before the holiday, he ordered his children to dig a wide, deep hole in the backyard. He told them it was for a new outhouse. Nobody asked questions. But that hole wasn't for a toilet. It was a grave. And on December 22nd, just before Christmas, Ronald made his move. The house was quiet when his first victim arrived. His eldest son, Ronald Gene Simmons, Jr. This was the same son who had allegedly reported the disturbing situation between Sheila and their father to the school counselor. And without any warning, Ronald struck Gene square in the forehead with a crowbar, hard and fast. But he didn't stop there. Fueled by uncontrollable rage, Ronald kept pounding, smashing Jean's face until his nose was shattered. Then, to make absolutely sure there was no chance of survival, he delivered one final brutal blow to his son's skull. And if that wasn't enough, Ronald stomped on Jean's groin, confirming his son was completely unresponsive. Some say Ronald's savage attack wasn't just blind fury. It was cold, calculated revenge. After all, Jean was the one who had exposed his father's monstrous secret to the school. Now Becky heard the terrifying sounds of the beatings echoing through the house and cautiously moved to check what was happening. But Ronald, always alert to any interruption, heard her footsteps and quickly hid in the shadows. When Becky stumbled upon the horrifying sight of her son drenched in blood, shock overwhelmed her. She was so distraught she didn't even notice Ronald creeping behind her. Before she could react, Ronald swung the crowbar with brutal force across her shoulders, knocking her to the floor. His eyes burned with a dark, vengeful fire. He blamed Becky for the rebellion of his children, seeing her as the root of his family's collapse. As Becky scrambled on the ground, desperate to escape, Ronald struck her again and again, breaking ribs with each merciless blow. Determined to inflict as much pain as possible, he turned the jagged teeth of the crowbar against her flesh, tearing away chunks of skin. By the time he finished, Becky was lifeless, but Ronald wasn't satisfied. To be certain, he pulled out a .22 caliber pistol and fired a final shot into the back of her head. The gunshot jolted 3-year-old Barbara, Ronald's granddaughter and the daughter of Jean Jr., awake. She began crying, small, frightened sobs that soon grew wearying to Ronald. Concealing the pistol behind his back, he entered her room, pretending to comfort her. His arms wrapped around her, but then they tightened around her neck. His hands squeezed mercilessly, cutting off the last desperate gasp of breath from Barbara's tiny body. Cold and methodical, Ronald dragged the bodies of those he had slain to the cesspit, the same one he had forced the children to dig when they first moved to the isolated property. Barbara had wet herself out of fear as she was choked to death. Ronald placed her body in a garbage bag and dumped it beside her grandmother's. To ensure no scavenging animals would disturb the grim scene, he wrapped barbed wire around the cesspit's perimeter. Finally, he doused the corpses with kerosene, masking the nauseating stench of decay with a temporary barrier. According to reports, Ronald's next victim was his 17-year-old daughter, Loretta. Her striking resemblance to Sheila, the daughter who had betrayed him, stirred a violent rage within him. He dragged Loretta into the living room, shoving her face into a barrel of ice-cold water. She fought with desperate strength, but Ronald's grip was unyielding. When she finally went still, he carried her lifeless body to the cesspit with the others. The remaining 3 children, Eddie, Marianne, and Becky, met the same grim fate, killed and discarded in the cesspit as well. The first to arrive were William H. Simmons II, age 22, his wife, Renata Mae Simmons, age 21, and their toddler son, William H. Simmons III, just 20 months old. Reports state Ronald shot the 2 adults in the dining room, then covered their bodies with coats and blankets, leaving them draped across the dining table. The infant was strangled and drowned, then placed in the trunk of a car parked behind the Simmons home. Shortly after, Ronald's 24-year-old daughter Sheila arrived with her husband, 33-year-old Dennis Raymond McNulty, and their 2 children, 7-year-old Sylvia and 21-month-old Michael. As they stepped inside, they took a few cautious steps before freezing in horror at the sight of the neatly arranged corpses lined up in a row. And just as he had done before, Ronald then unleashed his rage by shooting Sheila and Dennis. But the nightmare didn't end there. Grabbing their tiny 21-month-old son, he strangled the helpless child to death in a heartless act that defies comprehension. Once the boy was lifeless, Ronald callously dragged the little body outside and tossed it into a muddy patch, as if trying to erase the innocent life in the most degrading way possible. But Ronald's merciless fury wasn't finished. He then strangled Sylvia, his supposed child, with Sheila, and kept her body with the others. Evidence later revealed that Ronald had arranged the bodies of his entire family in neat, orderly rows inside the lounge, a macabre tableau of death. Each corpse was covered with coats except for Sheila, who was draped in Rebecca Simmons' finest tablecloth, a grim and eerie detail. What's even more chilling is that he placed Sheila and Dennis's son's body in the trunk of his car and abandoned it in a spot notorious for discarded, broken-down vehicles. Ronald clearly believed the boy, being Dennis's son, was unworthy to decompose alongside the rest of the family, a disturbing insight into his twisted mindset. After committing this brutal act, Ronald drove to a Sears store in Russellville, where he collected Christmas gifts he had ordered for his family, gifts meant to symbolize love and joy, yet purchased by a man who had just destroyed his own bloodline. That same night, in an almost surreal juxtaposition, Ronald headed to a private club to drink and celebrate what he called his successful plan, as if he had just conquered a victory rather than committed mass murder. He returned home afterward, spending the rest of the evening and the following day drinking beer and watching television, his chilling calm contrasting sharply with the horror he had wrought. Yet Ronald's quest for vengeance was far from over. On the morning of December 28, 1987, he took his son Ronald Jr.'s car to a Walmart in Russellville, where he purchased yet another gun, preparing for the violent rampage that would soon follow. His first target was the Peel, Eddy, and Gibbons law firm, where Kathy Kendrick, the woman who had gotten him fired for sexual harassment, still worked. Wearing a cowboy hat as a crude disguise, Ronald stormed in, and the office echoed with the terrifying sound of Kathy's screams, followed by a gunshot. She died before help could arrive, and at that time, Ronald's identity as the shooter remained unknown. Ronald's rampage didn't stop there. Next, he attacked the Taylor Oil Company, where he wounded Russell Taylor, the owner of the Sinclair Mini-Mart from which Ronald had recently resigned. During the chaos, he also shot and killed James Jim Chaffin, a fireman and part-time truck driver for Taylor Oil, the only victim in the spree who was a stranger to Ronald. After missing another employee, Ronald left the building and made his way to the Sinclair Mini-Mart, where he shot and wounded Roberta Woolery and David Saylor. His final stop was the Woodline Motor Freight Company, where he found his former supervisor, Joyce Butts, and shot her in the head and chest, seriously wounding her. In a chilling moment, he then took worker Vicki Jackson at gunpoint into the computer office and ordered her to call the police, demanding her to tell them, "I've come to do what I wanted to do. It's all over now. I've gotten everybody who wanted to hurt me."
9 more bodies found this morning in Dover. The victims may be the wife, children, and grandchildren of the gunman. The toll now stands at 16 dead in an Arkansas murder case.
The police investigation took a dark turn when officers searched Ronald's home and discovered the bodies of 14 family members hidden inside. The horror stunned the entire community. Ronald was sent for psychiatric evaluation, but doctors declared him sane, meaning he knew exactly what he was doing. It later emerged that Becky, his wife, had been secretly saving money to leave him, and she was not alone. Their 3 oldest children, all adults, were working together to help her escape. In a handwritten letter to her son William, Becky called herself a prisoner. "Dad has had me like a prisoner," she wrote. "Every time I think of freedom, I want out as soon as possible." Her letters spoke of loneliness, fear, and a dream of simple joys, like having a phone, going to church, or seeing her children anytime she wanted. She even called him Fatso in letters she never dared to send, and told Sheila she didn't want to give him anything, not even pity. Friends of Loretta said she knew her mom wanted to leave, but feared she couldn't support the kids. Becky hoped Loretta would live with her brother Ronald Jr. in San Antonio, far away from the nightmare at home. Her siblings noticed it too. Becky's sister said Ronald got stranger and stranger every year. Her brother said Ronald had turned their home into a prison. After the incest came out, Ronald lost control. The family avoided him, and the respect and fear was gone. That's what broke him. One chilling clue sealed it. A letter Ronald wrote to Sheila, enraged she had exposed him as the father of her child. "I will see you in hell," he wrote. When prosecutors presented that letter in court, Ronald snapped. He punched one in the face and lunged for a deputy's gun. The man who had controlled his family with fear couldn't control himself anymore. He didn't just want to destroy them, he wanted to make sure they never got away. During his first trial for the murders of Kathy Kendrick and Jim Chaffin, Ronald was found guilty on May 12, 1988, and sentenced to death. Remarkably, jury selection took less than 6 hours. On May 16th, Judge John Samuel Patterson sentenced him to death by lethal injection plus 147 years in prison. Ronald refused all rights to appeal, publicly stating, "I, Ronald Gene Simmons Sr., want it to be known that it is my wish and desire that absolutely no action by anybody be taken to appeal or in any way change this sentence. It is further respectfully requested that this sentence be carried out expeditiously." His refusal to appeal was unwavering as he faced his next trial for the murders of his 14 family members. On February 10, 1989, he was found guilty once more and again sentenced to death by lethal injection. To those opposing the death penalty, he coldly declared, "In my particular case, anything short of death would be cruel and unusual punishment." The court held a hearing and ruled that his decision to waive further proceedings was both knowing and intelligent. Ronald's case even reached the United States Supreme Court in Whitmore v. Arkansas after another death row inmate, Jonas Whitmore, tried to force an appeal on Ronald's behalf. Whitmore and Reverend Louis Fraun argued that Ronald's refusal to appeal threatened the appellate rights of other inmates. But by a 7-2 vote, the Supreme Court rejected this effort. Due to ongoing legal wrangling, Ronald's execution was delayed, and he spent his time on death row, isolated from other prisoners who constantly threatened his life for refusing to appeal and damaging their chances to beat death sentences. On May 31, 1990, Governor Bill Clinton signed Ronald's second execution warrant, setting his death for June 25, 1990, the fastest execution after sentencing in U.S. history since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Ronald refused all visitors, including lawyers and clergy, choosing to face death alone. His final words were chilling and deliberate. "Justice delayed finally be done is justifiable homicide." No family members claimed his body, and Ronald was buried in a pauper's plot at Lincoln Memorial Lawn in Varner, Lincoln County. Now, for those of us who've been covering true crime stories for a while, this one truly hits different. It's not just the number of victims. It's the haunting details, the twisted mindset, and how unbelievably small the reason behind it all was. You can't help but wonder, could someone have stopped this before it spiraled into one of the worst family massacres in history? Was there a moment, a sign, a cry for help that was missed? Ronald's death, by all accounts, felt like justice finally being served. But then there's that one detail that always sends chills. The idea that a father could actually father a child with his own daughter. I mean, what would you do if you ever heard of something that horrific happening around you?
This is the Napier family, and what you're about to hear will seriously make you question how one man could wipe out 5 adults in roughly 3 to 5 minutes. What makes this case especially heartbreaking, and honestly one of the hardest to talk about, is that there was a survivor. A little 4-year-old girl who somehow lived through it all. She was found wandering down a country road all alone, and when officers asked where her family was, she told them everyone inside was sleeping. But they weren't. What officers found inside that house would turn into one of the most horrific and bloody crime scenes Indiana had ever seen.
It's real devastating. We don't understand it. We don't see how it could happen.
For starters, this happened in September 2011 in Laurel, Indiana, a tiny, close-knit town that feels frozen in time. We're talking cracked sidewalks, a handful of streets, and maybe 500 people who all know each other by name. Most folks are born there, grow up there, and stay there. Work is mostly farms, livestock, and blue-collar gigs. A lot of homes or trailers set along winding country roads. It's quiet, friendly, and the kind of place where neighbors still wave. That's the world the Napier family and the Richardson family helped build over generations, long before any of this tragedy. Angela Angie Richardson came from a big local clan. Roy Napier did too. They met as kids, fell in love, married in the mid-'80s, and raised 3 children, Josh, Melissa, and Jacob. Roy hung drywall when his back allowed, took whatever jobs he could, and lived for football nights and poker with friends. Angie worked wherever work was steady, diners, a tool and dye shop. And she loved simple country things like gardening and spring mushroom hunts in the woods. Now, it's safe to say that money was always tight. On top of that, Roy's back injuries kept getting worse. The arguments came in waves, like they do when bills pile up and hours get cut. Eventually, Angie moved into a nearby trailer of her own. The split eased the fighting, and weirdly, it made them friendlier. Family still pulled them together, especially once Melissa had a baby girl named Sierra. Grandparents will cross any distance for a toddler's laugh. Angie stopped by almost every day. Roy kept the door open. Josh worked to help cover gaps. Jacob picked up farm work. Melissa studied to become a certified nursing assistant and tried to map out a life beyond the same 2 or 3 country roads she'd always known. By the mid-2000s, the Napiers were living in a small trailer off Stips Hill Road on land owned by Roy's mom, Shirley. But then came Sunday, September 25th, 2011. It was early afternoon when a driver passed Stips Hill Cemetery and saw a small child walking alone in the middle of the road. She was crying, dirty, and had no adults with her. The driver stopped, called for help, and waited until police arrived. In a small town like Laurel, word spread fast. The child's great-grandmother, Shirley, heard what happened and rushed over. She found her 4-year-old great-granddaughter, Sierra, and tried to calm her down. When Shirley asked where her family was, Sierra said something that made her heart drop. She told them her mommy was dead, but she said it in the way only a child could, as if everyone inside was just sleeping. Officers also noted that little Sierra was half naked when they found her, walking barefoot and confused along that quiet country road. With that information, officers approached the Napier family's home. But the moment they looked inside, they froze. What they saw made them immediately call the Indiana State Police and crime scene investigators. They knew right away this was no accident. While waiting for backup, officers checked the area. The woods were thick, and it was easy to hide there. Then they spotted a man nearby. When they ordered him to stop, he ran straight into the woods and disappeared. His truck was left behind, so they ran the plate and noted it for later. More officers arrived and secured the scene, their flashing lights cutting through the stillness of that quiet countryside. When investigators finally entered the small trailer, the sight that met them was devastating. 4 adults lay dead inside: Roy Napier, his estranged wife Angie, their daughter Melissa, and their teenage son Jacob. It was clear no one had survived long enough to call for help. The place was a mess, drawers pulled out, belongings scattered, and shell casings on the floor. Among the evidence was a clear shoe print that matched a skate shoe. As detectives searched more the area, they noticed a faint trail of blood leading away from the trailer and into the yard. They followed it carefully through the grass until it ended at another body lying just outside. That man was later identified as Henry Smith. With that discovery, the body count rose to 5. What first looked like a possible family dispute had now turned into a full-blown massacre. But who was Henry Smith? Who could have done something so violent? And more importantly, how did little Sierra survive when everyone else didn't? Investigators got to work fast. They photographed everything, logged every shell casing, footprint, and overturned item. Near Henry's body, they found a cell phone that stood out. It was oddly clean, completely free of blood, even though it was surrounded by it. That struck detectives as deliberate, like someone had wiped it down before leaving it behind. Inside the trailer, while collecting paperwork, they found something even more alarming, a restraining order form recently filled out by one of the victims, Roy Napier. On it, Roy had listed his own son, Josh, as the person he was seeking protection from. That detail changed the tone of the entire investigation. Officers first went to talk to Roy's mother, Shirley, who lived just up the road. She was still shaken, holding little Sierra close as she answered questions. She told investigators that the day before the murders, Roy and his son Josh had gotten into another argument. Things had been tense between them for weeks. Roy wanted Josh out of the house because he was causing trouble, trying to control the money, and clashing with everyone. Shirley said Roy had gone to the courthouse only a week earlier to file a restraining order against him. She also told police that Josh had been angry about it and was now living with his girlfriend Sandra, not too far away. That information was enough to make police want to find Josh right away. But Shirley also gave them something else to think about. She mentioned Henry Smith, the family's neighbor who was found dead outside. Henry had been a lifelong friend of the family, someone who helped with chores and spent time with Roy and the kids. Shirley said Henry wasn't the kind of man to get mixed up in anything bad. In fact, she said he might have tried to help the little girl escape when things went wrong, which would explain why his body was found outside. As police gathered more statements, they realized how close-knit this small community really was. Everyone knew everyone, and rumors spread faster than facts. Some neighbors told officers they heard gunshots around noon that day. Others said they saw strange cars passing through the area the night before. The police didn't have much to go on except for those fragments of witness accounts, the footprints at the scene, and the evidence collected inside the trailer. By that afternoon, officers went looking for Josh at his girlfriend Sandra's home. When they got there, she told them Josh wasn't around and that she didn't know where he'd gone. That answer didn't sit right with detectives. They left her house, put out a be on the lookout notice for Josh and his vehicle, and started asking anyone who had seen him recently to call in. While they searched for him, they kept working on processing the evidence. The phone found near Henry Smith's body turned out to belong to Angie Napier. It was strange because it was wiped clean. No fingerprints, no blood, and the SIM card had been removed. That kind of detail wasn't random. Whoever cleaned it had to know exactly what they were doing. Inside the trailer, investigators also found empty prescription pill bottles. They were labeled OxyContin, a strong painkiller that's common in rural towns like Laurel, where injuries from hard labor are frequent and pain medication gets traded like cash. Soon, talk about drugs became the main theory. Some neighbors mentioned that Roy might have been selling a few of his prescription pills to help support his family. With his back injuries and limited income, selling some of his meds on the side wasn't far-fetched. That detail opened a whole new angle. Maybe the murders weren't about family fights, but about drugs or money. Later that same day, the person police were looking for showed up. Josh Napier arrived at the roadblock near the trailer, asking what happened. When officers told him that his entire family had been killed, he broke down immediately. He said he didn't know anything about it, that he had heard about the murders through social media. Police could see he was emotional, but they also had to treat him as a suspect. They detained him for questioning. During the interview, Josh said that while he and his father had argued recently, he didn't hate him. He said the real conflict was between his parents, not between him and Roy. He explained that his dad didn't like his mom's new boyfriend, Jim Bilson, and that the two men hated each other. Every time Angie visited Roy's trailer, Jim would get angry, and that always led to fights. Josh said he tried to stay out of it, but everyone was stressed and money was tight. When police asked him about the restraining order, Josh looked genuinely confused. He said he had no idea why his dad would file one. He also insisted he hadn't been to the trailer that weekend. Investigators weren't convinced. They noticed Josh was wearing DC brand skate shoes, the same kind of shoes that left prints in the blood at the crime scene. That was a major red flag. They asked him to hand them over for testing, saying it was standard procedure, and Josh agreed. He told police he was staying with his girlfriend Sandra and had been there all night. It was an alibi, but one they planned to double-check. Over the next few days, investigators looked deeper into every possible lead. They interviewed Jim Bilson, Angie's boyfriend, who lived almost 3 hours away. Jim admitted he didn't like Roy, but said he'd never hurt anyone. He claimed that Angie borrowed his car the day before the murders, and that he stayed home for a barbecue with friends who could vouch for him. His story checked out, and police verified his alibi. Meanwhile, the coroner's report confirmed the worst. All 5 victims, Roy, Angie, Melissa, Jacob, and Henry, had been shot multiple times. 2 of them, Angie and Henry, also showed signs of being beaten. That detail stood out to investigators because it suggested the killer had a personal grudge against those 2. Whoever did this didn't just shoot them and run. There was anger behind it. Police received more tips from the community. One woman who lived nearby said she often saw strangers coming and going from Roy's trailer, which made her believe drugs were being sold there. Another neighbor said they'd heard there was a man who regularly bought OxyContin from Roy. His name, she said, was David Eisen, someone known around town for drug problems and a violent past. When detectives looked him up, his record spoke for itself. He had over 20 felony convictions, including armed robbery and burglary, and was already wanted for a recent pharmacy robbery in a nearby county. Things started falling into place. They learned from Josh that his father sold pills to a man who lived with his mother, a woman people called Blondie. That woman turned out to be Berlina Blondie Richardson, and her son was none other than David Eisen. Suddenly, everything connected. The OxyContin bottles, the robbery, the restraining order, the wiped phone, and the violence that didn't fit a simple robbery gone wrong. Police quickly got a search warrant for Blondie's house, where David was believed to be staying. Before they could move in, they discovered another major clue. Melissa Napier's phone, which had been missing since the murders, had pinged a cell tower just 5 hours after the killings. The tower was located right near Blondie's property. That confirmed David was in the area after the murders. With everything pointing to him, police surrounded the house quietly, waiting for the right moment. They had reason to believe David was armed and dangerous, so they called in an emergency response team. Hours passed as they watched the house, waiting for movement. Finally, just after 6 p.m, David and a woman came out and got into a car. As soon as they drove off, officers followed. When David stopped at a local gas station, police moved in fast, blocking his car and ordering him to put his hands out of the window. David Eisen was arrested on the spot. He didn't resist, but when officers searched him, they found something bizarre. He was wearing a fake beard, a wig, glasses, and even a hat to disguise himself. In his car, police found 2 loaded guns, a handgun and an AK-style rifle, along with blood-stained clothes, a phone that belonged to Melissa, and a pair of DC skate shoes that matched the print from the scene. It was clear they had their man, but even with all the evidence pointing directly to him, they still needed a confession to close the case completely. Investigators asked David where he had been during the time of the murders. He denied everything. He claimed he didn't even know the Napier family and had no idea what the police were talking about. When they pressed harder, he went silent and demanded a lawyer. That was the moment detectives knew. He was guilty, and he knew they could prove it. The woman who was with him during the arrest was his girlfriend, Amanda Napier. No direct relation to the victims, despite sharing the same last name. Amanda looked terrified, and when police questioned her separately, the truth slowly started to come out. She admitted that David had been obsessed with getting more OxyContin pills and that the Napiers were his regular source. On the day of the murders, she said, David planned to buy 50 pills from Roy Napier, but got angry when Roy only offered 30 and raised the price. That argument turned violent, and she claimed that David lost control. Amanda told investigators she had stayed in the car the whole time, waiting outside the trailer while David went in. But when he came back, he wasn't carrying pills. He was covered in blood. She said David jumped into the car, told her to drive, and said something that still haunted her. They're all dead. Amanda was crying when she gave her statement. She admitted that she didn't go to the police because she was terrified of him. David had threatened to kill her and her kids if she ever told anyone what he'd done. Forensic tests soon confirmed everything Amanda said. The blood on David's clothes matched the victim's. Melissa's phone was found in his possession, wiped clean just like Angie's. The DC skate shoes he had tried to wash were a perfect match for the bloody print inside the trailer. And the gunshot casings from the scene matched a .38 caliber handgun that police recovered during a later search. The evidence was overwhelming. David was officially charged with 5 counts of murder for Roy, Angie, Melissa, Jacob, and Henry, plus robbery and weapons charges. The news spread fast. The people of Laurel, still shaken, were both relieved and heartbroken. They couldn't believe someone from their own small community could commit such a horrific act. Many remembered David as a kid who had grown up nearby, gotten into trouble early, and never found his way out. He'd spent most of his life in and out of prison, with more than 20 felony convictions behind him. Now, his addiction and anger had turned him into a killer. Even his own father was in disbelief when he found out. When David was brought to court for the first time, he wore a bulletproof vest. His face was expressionless. The judge read each of the 5 murder charges aloud, and David just stared ahead. He pleaded not guilty, but as the days went by, the pressure mounted. The district attorney made it clear they were seeking the death penalty. That was enough to make David change his mind. In February of 2012, David Eisen accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to all 5 counts of murder in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. Instead, he would spend the rest of his life in prison with no chance of parole. Even though justice was technically served, the Napier family wasn't satisfied. Josh Napier, who had lost his parents and both siblings in one day, told reporters, "He gets to live, but my family doesn't." That's not justice. His Aunt Teresa, Angie's sister, agreed. She said, "He can still breathe, eat, and talk. My sister can't." At the sentencing hearing, several family members spoke directly to David. Teresa looked him in the eye and told him that she hoped every day in prison reminded him of what he'd done. She said she wished she could hang pictures of the victims in his cell so he would never be able to forget their faces. Josh also spoke, telling David that he would see him in hell for what he'd done. But the most powerful moment came from David himself, and not for the reason anyone expected. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, David stood up and gave a bizarre, cold-hearted speech. He said, "I'm sorry, but unless you've ever been on dope like I was, shooting up 10 times a day, you don't know how it is." His words shocked everyone in the courtroom. He wasn't remorseful. He was making excuses. Then, as family members shouted at him, David smiled and said, "I did Sierra a favor." He was referring to Melissa's 4-year-old daughter, the only survivor. That one sentence sent a wave of outrage through the courtroom. He was escorted out quickly as relatives yelled after him, furious at his cruelty. After the trial, investigators continued looking into Amanda's role. She had been the getaway driver, and even though she claimed she was scared, she didn't call police or warn anyone afterward. Eventually, she was charged with conspiracy to commit robbery. In 2014, Amanda pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with 4 years suspended. David's mother, Berlina Blondie Richardson, was also arrested for buying a gun for her son, since he was legally not allowed to own one due to his criminal record. The case was finally closed, but the pain it left behind never really left Laurel. The town was shaken to its core. Families who had never locked their doors now did. Neighbors who once greeted each other with waves now looked twice before opening up. The Napier family's home was eventually torn down, but the memory of what happened there still lingers. The funeral for Roy, Angie, Melissa, and Jacob was one of the largest the town had ever seen. Hundreds came to pay their respects. They were all buried in the same cemetery where little Sierra had been found walking alone that day, the Stips Hill Cemetery. Henry Smith, the neighbor who had likely tried to save her, was buried nearby. As time passed, people often mentioned Henry's bravery. Investigators believed he had grabbed Sierra and tried to run for help when the shooting started. That act of courage might have saved her life. It's something the community still remembers with pride and sadness. Sierra went on to live with her father, Lucas, but she was kept away from the rest of the Napier relatives for her own healing. The memories of that day were too painful for her to relive. Even years later, the Laurel Massacre is still talked about in Indiana as one of the worst crimes in the state's history.
This was the last the world saw of Raymond Ratima, jailed for life for killing 7 people.
This man was convicted of slaughtering 7 people, including his own children. And as you can see, he still had the audacity to blow a kiss at the camera, as if nothing had happened. That eerie moment alone cements him as one of the most cold-blooded mass murderers in New Zealand's history. And the name starts with Raymond Wayne Ratima, a man whose actions shook the peaceful town of Masterton, a place where people believed they were safe, where families built their lives, and where crime on such a horrific scale was nearly unthinkable. But in June of the year 1992, that belief was shattered forever. Masterton, at that time, was a relatively small and tight-knit community known for its rural charm and quiet suburban life. Located in the Wairarapa region, the town was surrounded by lush green farmland, rolling hills, and a landscape that painted a picture of serenity. The economy was primarily driven by agriculture, with sheep farming being one of the dominant industries. Many of the town's residents either worked in farming or in supporting industries such as wool processing, small-scale manufacturing, and retail. The pace of life was slow and predictable, and violent crime was a rarity. However, beneath this picturesque surface, economic struggles were beginning to take root. The early 90s saw New Zealand grappling with the effects of economic reforms from the previous decade. Many families, particularly those in working-class communities like Masterton, were feeling the pressure of rising unemployment and financial instability. Jobs were scarce, wages were low, and welfare support was often inadequate. For someone like Ratima, who was already struggling to provide for his family, these factors only added to his growing frustration and desperation. Now, while there's not much known about the early life of Ratima, or even how he met his wife, what we do know is that by the beginning of that fateful year, his life had begun to spiral downward. At the age of 25, Ratima and his wife Toni were struggling to keep their heads above water. Financial hardship weighed them down, making it impossible for them to keep up with the rising rent. With 3 young children to care for, they were forced to move into Toni's parents' home on Judd Street, Masterton. Living under the same roof as extended family members wasn't easy. The house was crowded, tensions were high, and Ratima's relationship with Toni was crumbling under the pressure. Arguments became more frequent, emotions ran high, and resentment festered. It was in this suffocating environment that the seeds of rage were planted. As the months dragged on, Ratima's anger only grew. It wasn't just the financial struggles, though they played a significant role. It was the feeling of being powerless, of being unwanted, of watching his world crumble before his eyes. He reached out for help. He sought assistance from social services, hoping for some relief, some way to get back on his feet. But the help he needed never came. He was left to stew in his despair, and that despair quickly turned into a murderous rage. By June, Ratima's marriage had completely fallen apart. A serious altercation between him, his wife, and her family was the final breaking point. He was thrown out of the house, rejected, cast aside. With nowhere to go and no support, his mind began to unravel. Days of little sleep, wandering with nothing but his anger and hopelessness for company, led him to one horrifying conclusion. If he couldn't have his family, no one would. On the night of June 26, 1992, Toni left the house to meet her parents, Philip and Rebecca Ferguson, at a local pub. She left behind her 3 young sons, Pierre, Barney, and Stacy, under the care of her sister Nicola. Also in the house that night were Toni's brother Philip, Nicola's de facto partner Bevan Tepu, and their young son Stephen. It was at precisely 9:25 in the evening when Raymond Ratima stormed back into the house, armed with a knife and a softball bat. The brutal attack that followed was nothing short of a massacre. He slaughtered everyone inside. He bludgeoned and stabbed 7 people to death, showing no mercy. Even his own children, his flesh and blood, were not spared. In a chilling act, he placed their lifeless bodies on his wife's bed and laid a Bible on top of them, as if it were some twisted attempt at absolution. The adults were no luckier. He piled their bodies on top of one another in another bedroom, stacking them like objects in a scene too gruesome to comprehend. But Ratima's bloodlust was not yet satisfied. He sat in the house, waiting for Toni and her parents to return so he could finish what he had started. When they finally walked through the door, the nightmare continued. Nicola's father, Philip, was the first to be attacked. Ratima swung the softball bat with full force, striking him in a brutal assault. But this time, things did not go according to plan. In the chaos, Toni managed to escape, running for her life to call for help. When the police arrived, the carnage they witnessed would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Blood soaked the floors, lifeless bodies filled the rooms, and in the midst of it all was Raymond Ratima, subdued, restrained, and no longer in control. Nicola's father, Philip, had overpowered him, preventing an even greater tragedy. The news of the massacre spread like wildfire. New Zealand had never seen such a horrifying crime. A father, a husband, a son-in-law, someone who was supposed to protect his family, had instead wiped them out in cold blood. The community of Masterton was left reeling, struggling to understand how something so monstrous could have happened in their quiet town. Ratima was arrested on the scene and taken into custody. His initial demeanor was eerily calm, as if he had accepted his fate. He offered little resistance, making no attempt to flee. During questioning, he showed minimal emotion, providing cold, matter-of-fact responses. Investigators were disturbed by his apparent lack of remorse. When Ratima stood trial, the nation watched in shock. He expressed remorse, but the sheer brutality of his crimes left many wondering if it was genuine or merely an attempt to save himself from the harshest punishment. During the trial, the prosecution painted a picture of a man who had allowed his rage and feelings of inadequacy to fester for too long. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Ratima had been pushed to his breaking point due to financial strain and rejection by his wife's family. Mental health professionals were brought in to assess his state of mind, but ultimately, the jury saw through any justifications. The judge described the killings as unimaginable and beyond comprehension. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for 7 counts of murder. Additionally, he was given 10 years for the killing of an unborn child and another 7 years for attempted murder. But even behind bars, the horror of what he had done did not fade. The parole board repeatedly denied his bids for release, citing his continued struggles with drug abuse. In 2008, the board noted that despite presenting himself as a reformed man in previous hearings, Ratima had relapsed into cannabis use, blaming his actions on a dark day in his past. But if you think he had given up, think again. Year after year, Raymond Wayne Ratima has stood before the parole board, pleading for his release. He insists that he has changed, that he has grown, that he is no longer the man he was when he committed those horrific crimes in June of the year 1992. Yet, each time, the board has denied his requests, stating the same concerns: his psychological state, his risk to society, and his lack of true remorse. It has now been more than 30 years since Ratima was sentenced, and despite numerous parole hearings, the board remains unconvinced that he is fit to re-enter the world outside prison walls. Ratima has been denied parole not just once or twice, but a total of 14 times. His repeated attempts to gain freedom have been met with the same result, and each rejection only adds to his frustration. His lawyer, Roger Eagles, has now taken a different approach, claiming that there is potential bias in the parole process. Eagles argues that one of the parole board members, Professor Philip Brinded, had previously prepared psychological reports on Ratima in the year 1992, and his involvement in the current parole decisions could create an unfair assessment. Eagles insists that Brinded's prior contact with Ratima, spanning back to the time of his original sentencing, raises questions about impartiality. He points out that Brinded is the only person on the board who has had extensive personal interaction with Ratima, and this could lead to preconceived judgments rather than an objective evaluation of Ratima's progress over the past 3 decades. The legal challenge does not stop there. Eagles has also argued that Ratima's repeated parole denials themselves are evidence of bias. He claims that despite Ratima undergoing rehabilitation programs and counseling, the board has never granted him even a single opportunity for conditional release, raising concerns about whether he is being treated unfairly compared to other prisoners with similar convictions. However, the parole board has maintained its stance, insisting that every hearing is based on up-to-date psychological evaluations and risk assessments rather than relying on reports from the past. They argue that Ratima's continued imprisonment is not the result of bias, but rather the outcome of his failure to meet the necessary criteria for release. Justice Lisa Preston, who is currently reviewing the case, has questioned why Ratima himself did not object to Brinded's presence on the board. Eagles responded by saying that it was not Ratima's responsibility to point out the issue, as he lacks the legal expertise and education to fully understand the implications of Brinded's involvement. Eagles further stated that Ratima has significant academic difficulties due to his background, and that it should have been the responsibility of the chairperson to raise the matter. He insists that the failure to do so places an unfair burden on Ratima and undermines the fairness of the parole process. Another point of contention in Ratima's case is the way his parole hearings have been conducted. Eagles has argued that previous hearings have gone off track, with the board focusing too much on questioning Ratima about his motivations for the crimes and the impact on his victims. He claims that the discussions have shifted from evaluating whether Ratima is fit for release to revisiting his past, which should not be the central focus of the hearings. Eagles contends that while it is understandable for the board to consider the severity of Ratima's crimes, parole decisions should be based on his rehabilitation and risk factors in the present rather than continuously re-examining the past. In the year 2021, it was revealed that Ratima had begun a relationship with a woman who had suffered childhood trauma. The board expressed concerns about this relationship, fearing that it could be a trigger for another violent episode. Given Ratima's history and the emotional volatility that played a role in his past actions, the board was deeply troubled by this revelation. They questioned whether Ratima was capable of forming healthy relationships, or if this new connection was a sign of unresolved psychological issues. Despite attending nearly 100 sessions with a psychologist, board members still believed Ratima lacked insight into his crimes, which made them skeptical of his ability to maintain a stable and responsible relationship outside of prison. The concern was not just about Ratima himself, but also about the potential harm that could come to his partner if he were released without proper safeguards in place. During one of his parole hearings, Ratima made a statement that only reinforced the board's concerns. He claimed that he had loved his children and at the time believed he was putting them in a better place by taking their lives. This statement sent chills down the spines of the parole board members, as it suggested that Ratima still harbored a distorted sense of justification for his actions. Rather than fully accepting the gravity of his crimes, his words implied that he had once rationalized them as an act of mercy. The board saw this as a major red flag, an indication that Ratima had not yet reached the level of self-awareness and accountability required for parole consideration. Despite these concerns, reports from inside the prison indicate that Ratima has generally maintained good behavior. He has been described as respectful within the prison environment, and there have been positive reports about his work while incarcerated. Additionally, Corrections has stated that there is no further need for additional rehabilitation programs, as Ratima has already completed the necessary courses. However, even with these positive notes, the parole board has remained firm in its decision to keep him behind bars, stating that good behavior in a controlled environment does not necessarily translate to safe behavior in the outside world. In his most recent parole hearing in the year 2024, Ratima made a significant admission. For the first time in over 3 decades, he acknowledged that the killings were intentional. This directly contradicted his previous claims that the murders were not premeditated. While this confession marked a departure from his earlier statements, it still failed to provide clarity on the most crucial question: why? Despite finally admitting his intent, Ratima refused to explain his motives, leaving the victims' families and the parole board unsettled. During the hearing, he expressed deep regret, stating, "I was a very selfish man for what I did. All I can say is that I really regret full-heartedly the decision that I made in order to kill all those many children and adults. I hate myself for what I've done." However, the parole board remained skeptical. They pointed out that his changing narrative over the years only raised further concerns about his credibility. Given his history of inconsistent explanations, the board questioned whether this newfound admission was genuine or simply another attempt to manipulate the system in his favor. The victims' families continue to oppose his release, maintaining that Ratima has never fully explained his actions or shown true remorse. To them, his admissions mean little without an honest, clear acknowledgement of why he did what he did. Many still believe that Ratima poses a danger to society and should never be granted parole. In response to these concerns, the board recommended that Ratima be transferred to a special treatment unit for violent offenders. However, he resisted the move, arguing that it would be a step backward in his rehabilitation rather than a constructive measure. Despite his efforts, the parole board once again denied Ratima's release. The ruling made it clear that while his latest statement represented a shift, it was not enough to justify granting him freedom. The board emphasized that public safety remained their top priority and that Ratima's risk factors had not diminished to a satisfactory level. For now, Raymond Wayne Ratima remains in prison. His next parole eligibility will come in the year 2025. Whether he will finally succeed in persuading the board remains uncertain. However, given his long history of denied applications, changing statements, and ongoing concerns from the victims' families, his path to release remains as difficult as ever. But what do you think about this case? Do you believe Raymond Ratima should be released, or do his actions and shifting statements prove that he is still a danger to society? Should the parole board continue denying his requests, or do you think he has shown enough remorse to deserve a second chance? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on this case. And before anything else, I want to give a special shout out to Isabel N. Zeed for the recommendation to cover this case. Thank you so much for your suggestion. If you have any cases you'd like me to discuss, just drop them in the comments and I might cover them next. As always, thank you for watching. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.